Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Relaxing. Tonight we step out onto a wide winter prairie where the land stretches so far that the horizon almost seems to curve away from you. The wind slides across the grasslands with nothing to slow it down. No forests, no hills, just an enormous plain dusted with snow and pale golden grass poking through like stiff bristles on an ancient brush. Somewhere ahead of you sits a small shape in the distance, low and dark against the whitened earth. That small shape is your home, or at least it will be. You walk toward it carefully, boots crunching through the crusted snow. The air feels thin and dry, and every breath carries the cold straight into your chest. The prairie winter does not creep in politely. It arrives with authority. Temperatures here can plunge far below freezing, and settlers quickly learned that surviving this landscape required stubborn determination and a certain amount of improvisation. You reach the house and pause. Calling it a house may feel slightly generous. At first glance, it looks more like a mound of earth that someone forgot to flatten properly. The walls are thick blocks of prairie sod, stacked carefully in uneven layers. Grass roots still cling to the soil, forming tangled threads that hold the bricks together. From a distance, it blends almost perfectly with the land around it. And that's exactly the point. A well-built sod house could blend into the prairie so naturally that travellers sometimes passed by without noticing it. Early settlers discovered that using the land itself as building material was not simply convenient. It was often the only option available. Timber was scarce across much of the Great Plains. When thousands of homesteaders moved west during the late 19th century, they quickly realized there were far more acres of grass than there were trees. One widely accepted historical fact is that many homesteaders used a tool called a sod cutter, or a break-in plough, to slice the prairie turf into long rectangular strips. These strips were then cut into bricks, often about 2 feet long and several inches thick. The roots of prairie grasses formed a surprisingly strong natural mesh that kept each block from falling apart. You reach out and touch the wall beside the doorway. It feels frozen solid. The surface is rough and uneven beneath your glove, bits of grass still visible in the packed soil. If you lean close, you can smell the faint scent of dried earth and roots. Not unpleasant exactly, just different from the smell of wood or stone. The door creaks slightly as you push it open. Inside, the light dims immediately. The walls swallow brightness instead of reflecting it. A small window allows a square of pale winter sunlight to slip into the room, but most of the interior remains wrapped in shadow. The air feels calmer here. Outside, the wind roars like a distant river. Inside, it becomes a muffled murmur pressing against thick earthen walls. You step fully into the house and close the door behind you. Already, the temperature feels different. Sod houses had an unexpected advantage. Thick earthen walls acted as natural insulation. Soil holds heat slowly and releases it slowly, which meant these homes could stay cooler in summer and warmer in winter than many early wooden cabins. Settlers who had lived through their first prairie blizzard quickly came to appreciate that feature. Of course, appreciation does not necessarily equal comfort. The room is small, perhaps 15 feet across. The ceiling hangs low enough that a tall person might instinctively duck. Wooden beams support a roof that looks like it was assembled with optimism and a certain willingness to experiment. But you are not here for luxury. You are here because this patch of prairie is now your claim. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, settlers could receive 160 acres of land if they agreed to live on it and improve it for several years. That promise pulled thousands of families westward, many of them arriving with only a wagon, a few tools, and an impressive amount of determination. The prairie did not greet them gently. You walk slowly across the packed dirt floor. Your boots leave faint prints in the dust. The floor feels uneven beneath your steps because it is simply the ground itself leveled and tamped down rather than covered with boards. A small iron stove sits near the center of the room. Right now it is cold. Soon you will learn that keeping that stove fed with fuel becomes one of the most important tasks of winter life. Firewood is scarce here. Many settlers burned twisted prairie grass, dried animal dung, or anything else that would produce even a small amount of heat. Yes, dried buffalo chips were once considered excellent fuel on the plains. That may sound like a joke, but diaries from prairie settlers mention it often. One traveller in the 19th century reportedly described buffalo chips as nature's firewood for a treeless land. It turns out necessity can make people remarkably flexible about their heating choices. You move toward the window. The glass is slightly cloudy frost creeping along its edges like tiny branching rivers. Outside, the prairie stretches in all directions. Snow skims across the ground in thin, drifting sheets carried by wind that never quite stops moving. It is beautiful and a little intimidating. People who grew up surrounded by forests or towns sometimes describe their first prairie winter as unsettling. The openness of the land created a strange feeling of exposure as if the sky itself had grown too large. Scholars still debate whether that psychological challenge affected settlers more than the physical hardships of the climate. Letters from the period sometimes mention loneliness and the unsettling quiet of the plains as often as they mention cold or hunger. You turn away from the window and take in the rest of the room. A simple wooden table sits near the wall. 2 chairs that look slightly uneven. A narrow bed frame with a straw mattress. Everything here serves a purpose. There is very little that could be called decoration. Yet the room carries a sense of effort. Every object had to travel hundreds of miles by wagon or rail. Every nail was valuable. Every plank of wood was carefully saved. You brush a bit of loose dirt from the table with your glove. More soil falls from the wall beside you. That is another charming feature of sod houses. Bits of earth occasionally crumble from the walls or ceiling, especially during the first year after construction. Settlers sometimes joked that they lived in houses that tried to slowly return themselves to the prairie. One quirky detail recorded in several homestead diaries mentions grass sprouting from the walls during spring rains. The living roots inside the sod brick sometimes decided they were not quite finished growing yet. You can imagine waking up one morning to find your house quietly trying to become a meadow again. You sit down on one of the chairs and listen. The wind outside rises and falls in long breaths. Snow taps softly against the window. Somewhere far out on the prairie, a coyote calls. For a moment, the little sod house feels very small, but it also feels steady. The thick walls hold back the wind. The roof keeps out the snow. The stove will soon bring warmth back into the room. It may not look like much, but this house represents something powerful. Survival. And tonight, as the prairie winter gathers around you like a vast quiet ocean of cold air, this small earthen shelter will become the centre of your entire world. You pull your coat tighter and glance toward the stove again. Soon the fire will begin. And with it, the long winter inside a house made of living prairie earth will truly begin. You stand beside the earthen wall and look more closely at the blocks that hold the house together. At first, they appear random, as if someone simply piled up chunks of ground in a hurry. But the longer you study them, the more you notice a pattern. Each block fits against the next with quiet purpose roots, tangled through soil like threads in a thick fabric. The prairie itself has become your lumberyard, and the prairie is very generous with grass. Outside beneath the snow lies one of the toughest natural surfaces on the continent. Prairie grass grows with roots that dive deep into the soil, sometimes reaching several feet underground. For centuries, those roots bound the soil together so tightly that early farmers struggled even to plough it. But that same stubborn strength made the sod perfect for building. Imagine the scene months earlier, before winter arrived. The air was warmer then, and the prairie shimmered green under a wide sky. Instead of snow crunching beneath your boots, the land carried the soft rustle of grass moving in waves. You were standing out there with a sod cutter. It was not an elegant machine. Most were simple steel blades mounted to a plough frame and pulled by a horse or mule. As the blade sliced through the turf, it peeled the top layer of prairie soil away from the ground in long strips. The grass roots held everything together, forming flexible ribbons of earth that could be cut into bricks. A well-known historical fact about sod houses is that these bricks were often about 2 feet long, a foot wide, and 4 inches thick. Settlers quickly discovered that those dimensions created blocks heavy enough to stay in place while still manageable enough to lift. Manageable is a slightly optimistic word. Each brick could weigh 30 pounds or more. Building a house required hundreds of them. You imagine yourself lifting block after block beneath the summer sun, sweat stinging your eyes, dust clinging to your hands, horses stamping impatiently while flies drift lazily through the air. It was exhausting work, but strangely satisfying too. The prairie gave you the material. Your own effort turned it into shelter. You walk slowly along the inside wall, now running your hand across the rough surface. Some blocks sit neatly aligned. Others tilt slightly as if they settled into place with their own quiet opinion. Settlers usually stacked the sod bricks like oversized building blocks, arranging them in staggered rows so the seams did not line up. That technique made the walls stronger and helped prevent cracks from spreading too easily. Mud often filled the gaps between bricks. The result was not beautiful in the traditional sense. No polished stone, no smooth timber. But the walls grew thick and sturdy, sometimes reaching 2 feet in thickness. That depth mattered when winter winds began their endless assault. You tap gently on the wall with your knuckle. It produces a dull, solid thud. Not hollow like wood, not sharp like stone, just dense, compact earth. A curious side effect of these walls was their quietness. Sound does not travel easily through packed soil, which meant the house could feel surprisingly calm even during heavy winds. Families living in sod houses often noticed how the walls muffled outside noise. Of course, they also muffled light. You glance toward the window again. The pale square of daylight still struggles to reach the far corners of the room. Early sod houses often had only 1 or 2 small windows. Glass was expensive and difficult to transport across the plains. Some settlers even used greased paper instead of glass during the earliest years. That probably did not create the clearest view of the prairie. Still, it was better than staring directly into a wall of dirt all winter. You sit back down and imagine the building process continuing day after day. The foundation usually came first. Settlers cleared a small patch of land, flattening the surface as best they could. Sometimes they dug slightly into the ground, so the house sat partly below the surrounding prairie. That trick helped shield the structure from strong winds. Then the walls rose slowly, brick by brick, row by row. Children often helped carry smaller pieces of sod, while adults handled the heavier lifting. Even neighbours might join in because life on the prairie encouraged cooperation whenever possible. Communities were scattered across enormous distances, yet settlers understood something important. If a neighbour struggled, everyone nearby might eventually feel the consequences. Helping someone build a house today might mean receiving help during a future crisis. You lean closer to the wall and notice something unexpected. A tiny thread of dried grass still sticks out from the soil. It reminds you that this house was once a living piece of the prairie itself. The grass grew here long before anyone imagined building a home on this land. Now it forms part of your protection against winter. A quirky little detail recorded in several prairie journals mentions that some families worried their sod houses might attract grazing animals. From a distance, the grass-covered roofs sometimes looked like small patches of pasture. There are a few stories of confused cows attempting to nibble the roof. Whether those tales are entirely accurate remains uncertain, but they reveal something charming about prairie life. When your house is made from grass and soil, it becomes slightly harder to explain to livestock where the field ends and the living room begins. You stand and walk toward the door. When you open it, the wind greets you instantly. Cold air slides inside like an uninvited guest. Snow dust skitters across the prairie in pale streaks. The house behind you suddenly feels even more valuable. Historians still argue about how quickly settlers adapted to sod construction. Some believe the idea spread rapidly because of pure necessity. Others suggest that earlier settlers in places like Nebraska had already experimented with earth-building techniques and later arrivals simply copied what worked. Either way, the method proved effective. Across parts of Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, entire communities once lived inside these earthen homes. Travellers crossing the plains in the late 19th century sometimes described landscapes dotted with small grassy mounds that revealed doors and chimneys if you looked closely enough. You step back inside and shut the door again. The wind fades to a muffled murmur once more. Inside this house, every block of soil carries a story of effort. Every wall represents hours of labor beneath open sky. The prairie did not offer lumber, so people built homes from the ground itself. You glance around the dim room again. The walls feel steady. The house may look humble, but holds a quiet kind of strength. The same strength that allowed grass to survive endless winds now protects the small life unfolding inside these earthen walls. Outside, the winter prairie continues stretching endlessly in all directions. Inside, the prairie has been carefully stacked into shelter, and tonight those living walls will stand between you and a long season of cold. You tilt your head slightly and study the ceiling above you. At first glance, it looks fragile, almost temporary, like something that might collapse if winter leans on it too heavily. Thick wooden beams stretch across the room from wall to wall. Resting on top of them is a layered mixture of branches, grass, and more sod blocks packed together into a roof that feels part shelter and part experiment. If the walls of the house came from the prairie, the roof is simply the prairie placed upside down. You stand slowly and reach up toward one of the beams. The wood feels rough beneath your fingers, still carrying the faint smell of sap and age. Lumber was precious on the plain, so settlers used it sparingly. These beams likely came from trees hauled in from distant river valleys or transported by wagon over long distances. Every board here arrived with effort. In many sod houses, the roof followed a fairly practical design. First came the wooden beams, often placed several feet apart. Across those beams, settlers laid thinner poles or branches, creating a basic frame that could support weight. On top of that frame, they spread layers of grass, hay, or straw to help block wind and moisture. Then came the final layer, more sod. Thick chunks of prairie soil were carefully placed across the roof until the entire structure looked almost like a piece of ground that had been lifted slightly above the horizon. A widely recognized historical fact about sod houses is that their roofs could weigh several tons once fully constructed. That might sound alarming at first, but the heavy weight actually helped keep the structure stable during prairie windstorms. The Great Plains are famous for winds that can sweep across the landscape with incredible force, and a light roof would have been easily carried away. This one, however, stays exactly where it belongs. You imagine the house during one of those early construction days. Neighbours stand on ladders or climb carefully along the beams, passing sod bricks upward from the ground. Each piece is placed deliberately, forming a thick blanket of earth over the roof frame. Slowly, the house disappears beneath its own covering of prairie. When they finish, the roof looks less like a roof and more like a low, grassy hill. In spring and summer, some soft roofs even begin to grow. Grass roots still alive within the soil sometimes wake again when rain arrives. Tiny green blades push upward towards sunlight, turning the house into something that resembles a living garden. Imagine explaining to someone that your roof requires occasional mowing. It happened more often than you might think. Several settlers recorded moments when wildflowers appeared unexpectedly on their roofs. Small patches of prairie plants sometimes returned, as if they had simply been waiting for the right moment. You look up again, half expecting to see a stray flower pushing through the ceiling. Thankfully, winter has paused that particular surprise. The roof still carries its own challenges, though. Sod roofs were strong, but they were not perfect. Snow piled heavily on top during winter storms, adding even more weight to an already massive structure. When temperatures rose slightly, melting snow could seep slowly downward through tiny cracks. That is when dripping began. You glance at a faint dark stain near one corner of the ceiling, a small reminder that water occasionally finds creative ways into places where it is not invited. Settlers quickly learned to patch leaks using extra grass mud or additional layers of wood. Roof maintenance became a regular part of prairie life. A house made from earth constantly reminded you that nature still had some say in its condition. Historians still debate how comfortable sod houses truly were during severe weather. Some accounts describe them as surprisingly cozy once a fire warmed the interior. Others mention cold drafts slipping through roof seams and water dripping steadily during spring thaws. Like many things on the frontier, the experience likely depended on how carefully the house had been built. You walk toward the stove again and picture smoke curling upward from its metal pipe. That pipe pushes straight through the roof, creating a narrow chimney that releases heat and cooking fumes into the sky. A sod roof had to be carefully cut to allow that pipe through without weakening the surrounding structure. If the opening became too wide, wind could force snow and rain down into the room. And prairie wind is not shy about testing weaknesses. You listen quietly for a moment. The roof above you remains still. Outside, the wind continues brushing across the land like a giant invisible broom sweeping the plains. Inside, the thick earthen covering keeps most of that motion at bay. Another curious detail, sometimes mentioned in prairie letters, involves animals investigating sod roofs. Because the top layer looked like natural ground rabbits, prairie dogs, and other small creatures occasionally wandered across it without realizing they were walking on someone's home. There are a few stories of families hearing faint scratching sounds overhead, only to discover a curious animal exploring their roof. It must have felt like living beneath a slightly confused memo. You move back toward the window and glance out across the prairie again. Snow drifts in soft lines across the grasslands. The sky hangs pale and wide above the frozen earth. From this distance, your sod house blends so completely with the landscape that it almost disappears. That quiet camouflage offered an unexpected benefit. During violent windstorms, low sod houses presented very little surface area for the wind to grab. Wooden houses with tall walls could sometimes suffer heavy damage, but sod homes crouch close to the ground like patient animals waiting out the storm. Nature built the prairie to withstand wind. By borrowing its materials, settlers borrowed some of that resilience. You run your hand once more along the wall and glance up at the roof beams. The house may not be elegant, but it carries a quiet practicality that grows more impressive the longer you study it. Grass and soil above you, grass and soil around you. The prairie has folded itself into shelter. Outside, winter stretches across the plains with endless patience. Snow will fall, wind will howl, temperatures will sink far below comfort. Yet beneath this thick roof of living earth, a small pocket of warmth will soon begin to gather around the stove. And in a land where trees are rare and storms are fierce, that humble roof made of grass and hope might be the difference between endurance and defeat. The longer you remain inside the sod house, the more your eyes begin to understand the room. At first, everything seemed dim and shapeless, but slowly the details emerge. Corners separate from shadow. Objects gain quiet definition. The small room reveals itself piece by piece. The walls feel closer than they first appeared. They lean inward, slightly, in places thick and heavy with packed soil. Their colour shifts between brown and grey depending on how the light touches them. Grass roots thread through the surface like delicate veins. If you brush your hand gently along one section, tiny grains of dirt loosen and fall softly to the floor. Living inside a house made from earth means the house occasionally reminds you what it is made of. The floor beneath your boots is simple packed round. It has been tamped down until it feels firm, but it still carries the uneven texture of the prairie itself. In some spots the soil is smooth from footsteps. In others it rises slightly where the ground was never perfectly levelled. People today often imagine frontier homes filled with rough wooden planks, but period descriptions reveal that many sod houses kept plain dirt floors for years. Lumber was simply too valuable to use where it was not absolutely necessary. You walk slowly across the room, your boots leaving faint dusty marks. Near the far wall sits a narrow bed frame. The mattress looks thin, stuffed with straw that has been packed down by long nights of sleep. A heavy quilt rests on top, folded neatly as if waiting for evening. Beside the bed stands a wooden chest. The chest holds nearly everything that cannot be replaced easily. Clothing, small tools, perhaps a few treasured objects carried all the way across the plains. For many settlers, that chest represented their entire portable past. You pause beside the table near the centre of the room. The table is sturdy but clearly handmade. One leg is slightly shorter than the others, forcing someone to wedge a small scrap of wood beneath it. On its surface sits a tin cup and a worn metal spoon. Not decoration, just survival tools. Contemporary frontier accounts often mention how little furniture filled early prairie homes. Many families owned only the essentials during their first years on the plains. A bed, a table, a stove, and a few chairs were often enough to claim the title of household. You sit down and rest your hands on the tabletop. The wood feels cool but comforting after the cold air outside. The room carries a faint smell of soil mixed with smoke from previous fires. It is not unpleasant once you grow used to it. It simply reminds you that the house and the land are closely connected. A small iron stove waits patiently near the centre of the room. It is the most important object in the house. Without it, winter here would feel far more dangerous. Temperatures on the Great Plains can drop dramatically once the sun disappears. Wind steals heat quickly, and the open landscape offers very few natural barriers. Written reports from early prairie settlers describe winter nights that felt almost impossibly cold. Some families even placed water beside the stove overnight to prevent it from freezing solid. You glance at the stovepipe rising towards the roof. Soon smoke will travel through that pipe and disappear into the sky above the prairie. The stove will glow faintly red, spreading warmth slowly across the room. For now, the air remains still and cool. You move toward the window and study the thin layer of frost that has crept across its edges. The glass blurs the world, slightly turning the distant prairie into a pale watercolour of snow and grass. The quiet is striking. People who grew up in towns often found the silence of the plains unsettling at first. There are no crowded streets here. No constant footsteps, no distant carriage wheels, just wind occasionally joined by the distant cry of an animal. Researchers examining pioneer diaries often notice how frequently settlers wrote about this quiet. Some described it as peaceful. Others admitted it felt almost eerie during the first months of prairie life. You lean your shoulder gently against the wall. The soil feels cool and solid through your coat. It holds a certain quiet strength that becomes reassuring the longer you stay inside. A curious note appears in several homesteaders' journals about the way sod walls sometimes changed over time. Small bits of grass embedded in the bricks occasionally dried and fell away, leaving tiny holes in the surface. Families often filled those gaps with fresh mud or clay to keep drafts from slipping inside. Living in a sod house meant accepting that your home was never quite finished. The prairie constantly nudged it towards small repairs. You glance toward the ceiling again. The beams remain steady, supporting the heavy roof above. A faint dusting of soil clings to the wood where tiny particles have settled over time. Someone once swept here, but the earth always finds its way back. You return to the chair and sit again, letting the quiet settle around you. Outside, the wind sweeps snow across the frozen grasslands in pale shifting ribbons. Inside, the thick walls soften the sound until it becomes little more than a distant whisper. It is strange how quickly the house begins to feel protective. A structure made from soil might sound fragile, but the opposite often proves true. Packed earth absorbs sound, holds warmth, and resists wind in ways that surprise many newcomers. Some historians continue to discuss whether sod houses were truly as uncomfortable as later stories sometimes suggest. Certain accounts describe them as damp and gloomy. Others recall them as surprisingly snug once families adjusted to their unusual materials. Perhaps both experiences. After all, comfort often depends on expectation. You rest your elbows on the table and look around the room once more. The space is small. The light is dim. The walls are made of the very ground beneath your feet. Yet there is something quietly remarkable about it. In a landscape where trees are scarce and winters are long, people found a way to build shelter using nothing more than patience, muscle, and the stubborn strength of prairie grass. Outside, the winter wind continues its endless journey across the plains. Inside, the little earthen room waits patiently for the fire to begin. And once that stove starts glowing, the sod walls around you will slowly gather warmth, turning this humble patch of prairie soil into a surprisingly dependable refuge against the vast cold outside. You begin to notice something about the prairie wind. It never truly stops. Even when it softens for a moment, it never completely disappears. It moves across the plains in long, invisible currents, brushing over the frozen grass and slipping between the scattered homesteads that dot the landscape. Sometimes it whispers quietly against the sod walls. Other times it rises into a steady push that feels almost personal. Right now it presses gently against the house. The sound is low and steady, like a long breath sliding across the earth. You sit at the table and listen. The thick earthen walls soften the noise, but they do not erase it entirely. The wind becomes a distant rumble that travels through soil and timber, reminding you that the prairie outside remains wide open and endlessly exposed. The Great Plains are famous for this constant motion of air. Modern meteorologists explain that the flat landscape allows wind to travel long distances without obstacles. In the 19th century, settlers did not use the word meteorology very often, but they quickly learned that the prairie possessed its own restless temperament. Period weather records from frontier settlements confirm that strong winds were one of the defining features of prairie life. Gusts could sweep across open land with surprising force, carrying snow dust and sometimes entire clouds of loose soil. Inside the sod house, however, the experience changes. The walls absorb much of the pressure. Packed earth does not rattle the way wooden boards might. Instead, it simply sits there, heavy and patient, letting the wind push without do you much success. You reach out and place your palm against the wall again. It feels steady. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost imagine the house sinking deeper into the prairie, anchoring itself against the wind like a stubborn rule. Still, the wind occasionally finds ways to remind you of its presence. A faint draft brushes the back of your neck. You glance toward the corner of the room and notice a tiny seam between two sod bricks where a thin thread of cold air has slipped through. It is not dramatic, just a small whisper of winter finding its way indoors. Families living in sod houses quickly became experts at sealing these little openings. Mud clay and bits of grass were often pressed into cracks wherever the wind tried to enter. Letters written by homesteaders sometimes mention how autumn became a season of careful inspection. Before winter storms arrived, people walked slowly around their homes, looking for every tiny gap that might allow cold air to sneak inside. You imagine someone kneeling beside this wall weeks ago, pressing damp clay into that narrow seam. The prairie rewards attention to detail. You stand and walk toward the door. The wooden boards feel slightly rough beneath your hand as you push it open a few inches. Instantly, the wind pushes back. A rush of cold air slips inside the room and curls across the floor. The difference between indoors and outdoors becomes obvious. Outside, the wind carries a sharp bite. It lifts loose snow from the ground and sends it skimming across the prairie like pale smoke. The horizon looks distant and empty beneath a wide grey sky. You step outside for a moment. The wind greets you, immediately tugging at your coat and brushing snow across your boots. Even standing still requires a little balance. The prairie offers very few barriers to slow the moving air. You turn and look back at the house. From this angle, it almost disappears into the landscape. The sod walls blend with the surrounding ground, their grassy texture echoing the prairie itself. That low shape was not an accident. Some researchers believe that settlers quickly realized how helpful it was to build homes that stayed close to the ground. Taller wooden buildings could catch the wind like sails, but sod houses crouched quietly beneath its strongest currents. You step back inside and close the door firmly. The wind fades once more into a muted presence. Inside the house, the air feels calmer. Not warm yet, but protected. The walls continue their quiet work, holding steady while the prairie breathes around them. You return to the chair near the table. The quiet settles again, interrupted only by the steady murmur outside. A curious little note appears in several prairie diaries describing how the wind sometimes created strange sounds around sod houses. Because the walls were thick and uneven, air occasionally moved across them in ways that produced soft whistling or humming tones. Some settlers joked that their houses sang during storms. Whether the sound truly resembled music probably depended on how generous your imagination happened to be. You glance toward the ceiling beams again. Nothing moves. The roof remains firmly in place beneath its heavy covering of soil and grass. The weight that once seemed intimidating now feels reassuring. The wind may push and tug, but the prairie itself sits on top of the house, refusing to be carried away. You lean back slightly in the chair and listen again. The wind rises for a moment, sliding across the roof with a faint rushing sound. Then it settles again into its endless wandering across the plains. Life here means accepting that the wind will always be part of the conversation. Some evenings it will howl loudly enough to wake you from sleep. Other nights it will simply whisper along the walls while the stove glows quietly in the centre of the room. Either way, the wind never truly leaves. Yet the sod house stands calmly within it, earth stacked upon earth, grass roots gripping soil, a shelter built from the same land that the wind has been shaping for centuries. Outside, the prairie stretches endlessly beneath a pale winter sky. The wind continues its restless journey across miles of frozen grass. Inside, the little earthen house listens patiently, letting the wind pass by while the quiet of the room grows deeper and steadier with every passing minute. Sometime during the night, snow begins to fall. At first, it drifts down gently, almost politely, settling across the prairie in soft layers that barely disturb the sleeping land. The wind carries it sideways in long, pale ribbons, brushing the grass and piling it slowly against anything that interrupts the open space. Your sod house interrupts it quite effectively. When morning arrives, you notice the difference immediately. The light coming through the window looks softer than usual, as if someone placed a thin blanket across the sky. The air inside the house carries a faint brightness that feels muted and quiet. You move toward the door and press your hand against the wooden boards. Cold greets you instantly. When you pull the door open, the prairie reveals a different shape than the one you saw yesterday. Snow is gathered everywhere. It lies across the grass in gentle drifts, filling low places and smoothing rough ground. Around the sod house, the wind has sculpted deeper ridges, pushing snow against the walls in uneven waves. In some places, the snow reaches halfway up the doorway. You step carefully outside. Your boots sink into the powder with a muffled crunch. The air fills top air, now the cold strengthened by the long winter night. Every breath turns into a faint cloud that drifts away in the wind. You glance back at the house. The lower walls are already disappearing beneath white drifts. Only the upper portion of the sod bricks remains visible, their grassy texture peeking out from the growing pile of snow. Frontier weather journals frequently describe how prairie storms could reshape the land overnight. Wind carried snow across open miles and deposited it wherever obstacles slowed its movement. Houses, fences, wagons, and even small hills became natural gathering points for these drifting piles. Your sod house has become exactly that. The drift continues building slowly along the windward side of the structure. At first, this might seem like a problem, but it's sometimes provided an unexpected benefit. Snow pressed against the outside walls acted as an additional layer of insulation, helping block wind and preserve warmth inside. It's almost as if the storm itself assists in protecting the house. You walk a few steps away and study the doorway more carefully. The snow reaches nearly to the bottom hinge. If the drift grows much deeper, opening the door could become difficult. Settlers on the plains learned quickly that winter storms required regular maintenance of entryways. People often kept shovels or sturdy boards near the door so they could dig themselves out after heavy snowfall. Some accounts from Prairie families describe mornings when doors would not open at all until someone pushed through a window and cleared the drift from the outside. It sounds inconvenient. It was also completely normal. You brush a bit of snow from your coat and look across the prairie again. The horizon appears softer now. Snow has erased many of the small textures in the landscape, turning the plains into a vast pale blanket stretching towards the sky. In the distance, thin lines of drifting snow slide along the ground like ghostly rivers. You return to the doorway and step back inside. The air immediately feels calmer again. You close the door firmly and shake a few loose flakes from your coat. They melt slowly on the packed dirt floor, leaving small dark spots that fade within minutes. The room remains quiet. Outside, the wind continues pushing snow along the prairie, but the thick sod walls soften the storm into little more than a steady murmur. You move toward the window and notice something interesting. Snow has begun to pile along the lower edge of the glass. The drift grows slowly, creeping upward inch by inch as the wind deposits more powder against the house. This gradual burial happens so frequently that settlers often expected it during winter storms. Several letters written by homesteaders mention how houses could appear almost half buried by late winter. Only the roof and chimney sometimes remain clearly visible above the snow. Yet the home still functioned perfectly well. A curious anecdote preserved in one pioneer memoir describes children using winter drifts as temporary playgrounds. When snow piled high against the sod walls, youngsters occasionally climbed the drifts and found themselves standing almost level with the roof. Imagine stepping outside your front door and discovering that the landscape had quietly lifted itself halfway up your house overnight. You walk toward the stove again and imagine the fire that will soon warm the room. The drifting snow outside forms an additional barrier against the cold wind. The thick earthen walls continue holding steady. Together they create a small pocket of protection within the enormous winter landscape. Still, historians continue discussing how settlers balanced the benefits and challenges of these snowdrifts. While insulation helped retain warmth, heavy snow could also block doors, cover windows, and make travel nearly impossible for days at a time. Like many aspects of prairie life, the same storm could provide both help and hardship. You sit down once more and listen carefully. The sound outside has changed slightly. Snow sliding along the walls produces a soft scraping noise, almost like sand brushing across wood. The wind lifts loose powder and sends it tapping gently against the window. The storm is not violent, but it is persistent. You glance again at the faint light coming through the window. The world outside has become quieter, softer, and slightly hidden beneath layers of drifting white. Inside the sod house, however, the little room remains steady. The walls hold firm, the door stands closed, and slowly, almost patiently, the prairie winter begins stacking snow against your earthen shelter, shaping the landscape around it until the house becomes part building, part snow-covered hill, resting quietly in the middle of the frozen plains. You begin to understand very quickly that warmth on the prairie is never accidental. It must be created, protected, and carefully managed. The small iron stove standing in the centre of the room is no longer just a piece of furniture. It is the quiet heart of the house. Without it, the sod walls would still block the wind, but the cold would slowly creep into every corner, till the room felt nearly as frozen as the prairie outside. You kneel beside the stove and lift the small metal door. Inside waits a dark chamber that will soon hold the fire responsible for your survival through winter nights. The iron feels cold beneath your fingers, almost as cold as the dirt floor. That will change soon enough. Across the Great Plains, the arrival of winter forced settlers to think about heat in ways many of them had never considered before. In forested regions, wood could be gathered with relative ease. On the open prairie, however, trees were rare visitors. Early homesteaders discovered that fuel required creativity. Frontier letters and settlement records repeatedly mention that families burned anything capable of producing heat. Twisted prairie grass, dried sunflower stalks, and pieces of imported lumber all found their way into prairie stoves. But the most famous fuel of the plains came from a rather unusual source: buffalo chips. The phrase might sound humorous today, but it was an everyday reality for people living on the frontier. Dried bison dung scattered across the plains provided a surprisingly effective fuel source once it hardened under the sun. Travellers crossing the prairie during the 19th century often wrote about collecting these dried pieces and stacking them carefully for winter fires. They burned slowly and produced steady heat, making them extremely valuable in places where trees were scarce. You place a few pieces of fuel inside the stove and strike a match. The small flame flickers for a moment before catching the kindling. A thin curl of smoke rises through the stovepipe and disappears upward toward the roof. Soon the fire begins to grow. A gentle orange glow spreads through the stove's small window. The metal warms gradually and the room begins its slow transformation from cold shelter to livable space. Heat on the prairie works patiently. It spreads outward from the stove in quiet circles. The air near the fire warms first, followed slowly by the rest of the room. The thick sod walls absorb some of this warmth and hold it, releasing it slowly over time. You move to a chair to cool those ears. To the stove and sit down. Already the difference feels noticeable. Your hand stretched toward the growing warmth while the cold air near the window remains distant and still. This small balance between warmth and chill becomes a daily rhythm inside sod houses. Maintaining that balance required constant attention. Fuel could never be wasted. Fires had to be fed carefully throughout the day and banked at night so they would last until morning. Allowing the stove to go completely cold meant starting again from scratch, which could be unpleasant when temperatures drop far below freezing. Some settlers described waking before sunrise simply to coax dying embers back into flame. That quiet early morning ritual became part of prairie life. You lean slightly closer to the stove and listen to the faint crackling of the fire. The sound feels comforting after the steady whisper of wind outside. A small warmth spreads across the room. The air softens. The dirt floor begins losing its icy bite. One curious detail recorded in several pioneer journals mentions how families sometimes use the stove for far more than heating and cooking. During especially cold spells, boots, mittens, and even damp clothing were arranged carefully around the stove to dry overnight. Imagine a ring of wool socks and gloves surrounding the fire like silent little guardians of warmth. The stove was not simply an appliance, it was the centre of daily life. You glance up toward the stovepipe where faint heat shimmers the air. The pipe carries smoke through the roof and into the wide prairie sky above. Installing those pipes required careful attention. Too much heat near the surrounding sod could create fire hazards, while poorly sealed openings allow cold drafts to slip inside. Researchers studying frontier construction still discuss how settlers balance these risks. Some evidence suggests that sod houses were actually less vulnerable to fire than wooden cabins, because the thick earth walls did not burn easily. Others note that improperly installed stovepipes occasionally caused problems. The truth likely depended on how carefully each house was built. You lean back in the chair and allow the warmth to settle across your coat. Outside winter continues its slow work across the prairie. Snow drifts along the ground and wind moves steadily across the open land. Inside, the little stove quietly pushes back against the cold. The warmth spreads slowly into the sod walls themselves. Packed earth absorbs the heat and releases it gradually, creating a gentle stability inside the room. Even when the fire fades slightly, the walls continue holding some of that warmth. That quiet cooperation between stove and soil makes the house surprisingly effective against winter temperatures. You extend your hands again toward the fire. The iron door glows faintly now. A soft ticking sound comes from the stove as the metal expands under heat. For the first time since morning, the room begins to feel comfortable. Outside, the prairie wind continues its endless wandering across miles of frozen grass. Inside the sod house, a small circle of warmth grows steadily around the stove, turning a shelter made from earth into something that feels a little closer to home. As the warmth from the stove begins spreading through the room, your thoughts drift toward another daily necessity that prairie winter refuses to simplify: food. Out here, meals are shaped almost entirely by what can survive months of cold distance and isolation. The prairie does not offer easy grocery runs. Every ingredient inside this house has travelled here with effort, or has been preserved carefully against the long season. You stand and move toward a small wooden shelf fixed against the wall. Several simple containers rest there: a cloth sack of flour, a tin holding salt, a jar of preserved vegetables whose cloudy glass hides the pale shapes inside. Each item carries a quiet importance. On the frontier, food is rarely decorative. It is practical, filling, and often repetitive. Written accounts from prairie homesteaders frequently describe winter meals built around a few reliable ingredients. Flour beans, dried meat, and root vegetables formed the backbone of many diets during the colder months. These foods stored well and could survive long journeys by wagon before reaching isolated homesteads. You lift the lid from a small pot resting near the stove. Inside sits a modest mixture that has begun warming beside the fire. The scent rises gently through the air, carrying a simple aroma of broth and grain. Nothing elaborate, but deeply comforting after hours spent in cold prairie air. Cooking inside a sod house required careful use of the stove. The same fire responsible for heat also prepared every meal. Pots rested directly on the metal surface, while small ovens sometimes sat nearby, absorbing heat slowly. With patience, settlers learned to produce bread stews and simple baked dishes using this modest equipment. The rhythm of cooking followed the rhythm of the fire. Too much heat burned food quickly. Too little left it simmering for hours. You stir the pot slowly with the spoon resting beside it. The steam curls upward in pale ribbons that disappear near the ceiling beams. The warmth of the stove transforms the air immediately around it, creating a comfortable little pocket of heat. Out on the prairie, winter demanded planning long before the first snowfall arrived. Frontier supply records reveal that many families spent autumn preserving as much food as possible. Vegetables were stored in root cellars or buried in cool soil. Meat was salted, dried, or smoked. Grains were packed into sacks and kept safe from moisture. Without that preparation, winter could become far more difficult. You glance toward the wooden chest near the wall again. Inside it may rest small sacks of cornmeal or dried beans, saved carefully for the coldest weeks. Every handful mattered. Waste was something settlers tried very hard to avoid. A faint bubbling sound rises from the pot. You lift the lid again and watch the surface ripple gently. One lesser-known detail from prairie life appears in several letters written by homesteading families. When certain supplies ran low, creative substitutions sometimes appeared in recipes. Wild prairie onions gathered during warmer months and dried for storage occasionally found their way into winter stews. They added flavour and a surprising reminder of the growing season long after the ground had frozen. You take a small taste from the spoon. The broth feels warm and simple, filling rather than exciting. That was often the goal. Meals needed to sustain long hours of work and provide warmth rather than luxury. Still, the act of cooking itself carries a certain comfort. The smell of food spreads slowly through the room, mixing with the faint, earthy scent of the sod walls. Outside, the prairie wind continues its steady wandering. But inside the little house, the atmosphere grows warmer and more welcoming. You set the spoon down and glance toward the window. Snow still drifts across the plains in pale streaks, though the storm seems quieter now. The light filtering through the glass has brightened slightly, turning the snowy ground into a soft field of white. Even simple meals feel more satisfying when eaten while watching winter unfold outside. You carry the pot carefully to the table and sit down. Steam rises from the bowl as you pour a portion into the tin cup. The warmth reaches your hands instantly, spreading through your fingers and up your arms. Food often served another important role during prairie winters. It lifted spirits. Researchers studying pioneer diaries often notice how settlers described meals not just as nourishment, but as moments of pause during long winter days. Gathering around the stove with a bowl of something warm created a small sense of comfort in an otherwise demanding environment. You lift the cup and take another slow sip. The broth tastes simple but satisfying. The stove crackles quietly behind you while the wind brushes softly against the walls. For a moment the room feels peaceful in a way that almost hides the harsh landscape outside. Another interesting note preserved in prairie letters mentions how certain foods became small luxuries during winter. A jar of preserved fruit or a loaf of fresh bread could feel almost celebratory after weeks of plain meals. Those little treats carried a powerful emotional weight. They reminded families of harvest seasons and warmer days. You set the cup back down and listen again to the quiet room. The sod walls continue holding steady against the wind. The stove glows gently nearby. The meal warms your hands and stomach at the same time. Experts examining frontier life sometimes discuss how settlers balance physical hardship with moments of routine like this one. The work was difficult and the environment demanding, but small daily rituals helped create stability inside homes scattered across the plains. Cooking was one of those rituals. Preparing a meal beside the stove, stirring a pot while snow drifted across the prairie outside, became part of the rhythm that allowed families to endure the long winter months. You finish the last sip from the cup and place it quietly on the table. Outside the prairie remains vast, cold, and endlessly open. Inside the sod house, the warmth of food and fire continues building, a small island of comfort against the frozen world beyond the walls. Evening settles across the prairie slowly, almost gently. The pale winter light outside begins fading into soft shades of grey and blue. Snow reflects what little daylight remains, giving the land a quiet glow that lingers long after the sun itself has disappeared. Inside the sod house, the shadows deepen, but the small stove continues radiating warmth into the room. Night on the prairie always brings a new challenge. Sleeping. You move toward the bed against the wall and run your hand across the quilt folded neatly on the top. The fabric feels thick and heavy, stitched together from pieces of cloth that likely travelled many miles before finding their place here. Quilts were among the most treasured possessions many settlers owned, not just because they were warm, but because they often carried memories of home. Some were made by mothers or grandmothers before families began the long journey west. Others were pieced together slowly on the frontier from whatever scraps could be spared. You lift the quilt and lay it back across the straw mattress. The mattress itself feels firm beneath your palm. Inside it rests a bundle of dried straw packed tightly within a simple cloth casing. It may not look luxurious, but it serves its purpose surprisingly well. Straw mattresses provided a layer of insulation between sleepers and the cold air circulating near the floor. Contemporary accounts from prairie settlers frequently mention how bedding became one of the most important defenses against winter cold. Multiple quilts, blankets, and animal skins were often layered together to trap body heat during the night. The prairie did not offer mercy once darkness arrived. Temperatures could drop sharply after sunset, especially when the wind strengthened all across the open land. You sit on the edge of the bed and glance toward the stove. The fire inside continues burning steadily, casting a soft orange glow that flickers across the earthen walls. The warmth it provides will last for several hours, but by morning the embers may fade unless someone wakes to feed the fire again. Many frontier families developed quiet nighttime routines around the stove. Before going to sleep, they carefully arranged the remaining fuel so the fire would burn slowly through the darkest hours. This practice, often called banking the fire, helped preserve heat without consuming all the precious fuel before dawn. You remove your boots and place them near the stove. The leather will warm slightly overnight, making them easier to put on in the morning. Boots left too close to the cold floor sometimes stiffened with frost by sunrise. That small trick was passed between settlers like useful wisdom. You pull the quilt up and settle into the bed. At first, the mattress feels cool, but the warmth from the room soon begins spreading through the layers of cloth and straw. The thick sod wall beside the bed blocks much of the wind outside, allowing the little sleeping space to feel almost sheltered. Still, winter always finds subtle ways to remind you of its presence. A faint chill lingers near the floor. Cold air drifts gently around the edges of the room. These quiet reminders encourage one simple solution: more blankets. Frontier households often layered several quilts together during particularly cold nights. In some cases, families even shared beds simply to preserve warmth more effectively. Body heat became an important resource when temperatures dropped well below freezing. One interesting detail appears in a few prairie diaries describing how settlers sometimes warmed stones near the stove before placing them at the foot of the bed. Wrapped carefully in cloth, the heated stones released warmth slowly through the night. Imagine slipping your cold feet beneath blankets only to discover a small pocket of gentle heat waiting there. It must have felt wonderful after a long winter day. You pull the quilt slightly closer around your shoulders and listen to the quiet room. The stove ticks softly as the metal adjusts to cooling temperatures. Outside, the wind continues brushing across the prairie in long, steady breaths. The sound travels faintly through the sod walls. It no longer feels threatening. Instead, it becomes part of the background rhythm of prairie nights. Researchers studying pioneer life sometimes discuss how quickly settlers adapted to sleeping conditions that might seem uncomfortable today. Modern homes maintain steady temperatures and thick mattresses, but frontier families learned to rest under far simpler circumstances. Sleep came easily after long hours of physical labor. The body welcomed any chance to recover. You shift slightly beneath the quilt and watch the stove's glow dim and brighten with each flicker of the fire. Shadows move slowly along the walls, stretching and shrinking like silent companions in the room. Outside, the prairie sky grows darker. Stars begin appearing one by one above the frozen plains. With no towns nearby to produce artificial light, the night sky becomes astonishingly clear. Even through the small window, you can glimpse a few bright points shimmering in the distance. The quiet grows deeper. Somewhere far away, a coyote calls across the open land, its voice echoing faintly through the winter air. The sound rises and falls before fading again into the vast silence of the plains. You close your eyes for a moment. The quilt holds your warmth. The straw mattress supports your weight. The sod walls stand firm against the wind. Life inside a sod house may lack many comforts that people take for granted today, yet the essentials remain here: shelter, warmth, and a place to rest after the day's work. Historians still discuss how families balanced hardship with resilience during these long prairie winters. While the conditions were demanding, many settlers developed routines that allowed them to endure and even adapt to the environment around them. You breathe slowly and listen to the faint crackling of the stove. The fire continues glowing softly, guarding the room through the early hours of night. Outside, the prairie stretches endlessly beneath a sky full of quiet stars. Inside the sod house, wrapped beneath heavy quilts and sheltered by the thick earthen walls, you drift slowly towards sleep while winter moves patiently across the frozen plains. Morning returns quietly the way it often does on the prairie. The sky outside the small window brightens, slowly shifting from deep blue to pale silver. The stove has cooled during the night, and the air in the sod house carries a gentle chill again. You pull the quilt aside and sit up, noticing immediately how the room has changed while you slept. The walls look slightly different. At first, you cannot quite explain why. The sod bricks remain where they were yesterday. The beams above your head hold steady beneath the roof. The table and stove sit patiently in their places. But something small has happened. You swing your feet onto the dirt floor and walk toward the wall near the window. As the morning light grows stronger, a thin thread of green becomes visible along one seam between the sod blocks. Grass. A small blade pushes outward through the packed soil, delicate but determined. Its colour stands out against the brown wall like a tiny flag announcing that the prairie itself has not completely surrendered to winter. It's one of the stranger features of living in a house made from living earth. When settlers cut sod bricks from the prairie, the grass roots remained tangled through the soil. Even after the blocks were stacked into walls, some of those roots stayed alive. When warmth and moisture returned, they sometimes tried to grow again. Frontier letters from the late 19th century occasionally mention families waking up to find bits of green sprouting from their walls or roof. The sight could be surprising at first, but most settlers treated it with quiet amusement. After all, if your house is made from grassland, the grass may eventually attempt to reclaim it. You reach out and gently touch the small blade. It bends easily beneath your finger. Outside the window, the prairie remains pale with snow, yet inside this tiny fragment of the growing season has found its way into your home. You move slowly around the room, noticing other small signs of life within the walls. Here and there, faint traces of dried roots still weave through the soil. In some places, they appear like delicate threads stitched through fabric. These roots are one reason sod bricks hold together so well. Prairie grasses develop extremely deep and dense root systems that bind the soil with surprising strength. Agricultural reports written during the settlement era often remarked on how difficult it was to break prairie sod with ordinary ploughs. The roots formed a dense natural mat beneath the surface, which made farming both challenging and rewarding once the land was finally prepared. That same strength now supports the walls around you. You sit down again at the table and glance toward the stove. Soon you will need to coax the fire back to life. Morning warmth never arrives automatically here. It requires effort and attention, just like nearly everything else on the prairie. But before that you listen. The room feels very still. Somewhere inside the wall near the door comes a faint scratching sound. It lasts only a second, then disappears. You tilt your head slightly. Another soft scrape follows, almost like someone lightly brushing sand against wood. You smile. It would not be surprising if a small insect or tiny prairie creature had found its way into the sod bricks. The walls are thick and full of narrow passages between roots and soil. Pioneer journals occasionally mention how sod houses sometimes hosted unexpected guests. Beetles, spiders, and other small insects occasionally explored the walls, especially when warmth from the stove created a more comfortable environment inside the structure. One humorous recollection from a homestead memoir describes grasshoppers appearing inside the house during warm seasons because they had hatched from eggs hidden in the sod bricks. Imagine discovering that your walls have quietly stored next summer's insect population. You stand and stretch slowly, the stiffness of sleep fading from your shoulders. The prairie outside looks calm this morning. Snow lies smooth across the open land, and the wind has softened into a gentle drift that moves powdery flakes across the ground. Yet the living walls of the house remind you that the prairie is never truly absent. It surrounds you above and below. The soil beneath your feet forms the floor. The sod bricks around you shape the walls. Even the roof carries its own patch of prairie earth resting quietly overhead. You walk toward the window again. The light has grown stronger now, revealing faint patterns in the snow outside. Small ripples formed by wind stretch across the white surface like waves frozen in time. Researchers studying prairie architecture often discuss how these earth homes created a unique relationship between settlers and the land. instead of separating people from the environment with lumber or stone-sod houses, placed families directly within the materials of the prairie itself. The result was both practical and strangely intimate. You lived inside the land that sustained you. Of course, that closeness came with challenges. Dirt occasionally fell from ceilings. Walls sometimes sprouted grass. Small creatures occasionally wandered through unseen tunnels within the sod, but the structure remained strong. You glance again at the tiny green blade growing beside the window. For a moment, it feels almost symbolic. Even during the depth of winter, the prairie continues holding the quiet promise of growth somewhere beneath the frozen surface. You return to the stove and kneel beside it. The embers inside have faded to dull grey, but a faint warmth still lingers beneath the ash. With careful movement, you place fresh fuel inside and strike a match. The flame catches slowly. Soon a soft glow begins spreading through the iron chamber once more. As the fire grows, the little sod house wakes again. The walls warm slightly, the air softens. The quiet room becomes a small centre of life surrounded by the vast winter prairie, and somewhere inside the wall near the window that stubborn green blade continues its quiet attempt to grow. Later in the winter, the weather performs one of its quieter tricks. For days, the prairie may remain frozen solid, the snow resting peacefully across the open land while the sky stretches clear and pale overhead. Then, almost without warning, the temperature climbs just enough to change the behaviour of everything around you. Snow begins to soften. Often, ice loosens its grip, and the roof above your head starts to drip. You notice it first while sitting at the table. A faint tapping sound reaches your ears. At first it blends with the quiet crackle of the stove, but slowly the rhythm becomes clearer. Tap, tap, tap. You glance upward. A tiny drop of water forms along the edge of a sod seam in the ceiling. It gathers slowly, growing round and heavy before falling quietly onto the dirt floor below. The prairie winter has entered a brief thaw. These temperature swings were common across the Great Plains. Weather records kept by a frontier settlement show that winter did not always remain steadily frozen. Periods of milder air sometimes drifted across the plains, warming the landscape just enough to melt snow sitting on rooftops. When that happened, sod houses developed their own particular challenges. The roof above you holds several layers of earth grass and plant roots. During colder days, the entire structure remains frozen solid, but when temperatures rise, moisture hidden within that soil begins to move. Small rivulets form, and gravity encourages them to travel downward. You stand and reach for a small metal pan resting near the stove. When you place it beneath the dripping seam, the soft tapping sound changes to a gentle metallic ping. Settlers quickly learned to keep containers handy during winter thaws. Frontier letters occasionally describe how ceilings inside sod houses could develop several small leaks at once when snow melted quickly. Families moved bowls, buckets, and cooking pots around the room like an improvised orchestra of dripping water. It may not sound glamorous, but it kept the dirt floor from turning muddy. You glance around the ceiling carefully. Another drop gathers near one of the wooden beams, then another. Fortunately, the dripping remains slow and manageable. The roof still holds its shape firmly, and the sod bricks above continue providing solid protection against wind and cold. A small thaw may bring inconvenience, but it also reminds you of something important. Spring will eventually return. You lean against the wall beside the window and watch the snow outside begin to soften under pale sunlight. The once powdery surface now glistens slightly, reflecting light in tiny sparkles. In places where wind carved deep drifts, the snow settles slowly as melting begins beneath the surface. Life on the prairie often moved between these subtle shifts. Researchers studying frontier housing sometimes discuss how settlers adapted their maintenance habits around seasonal weather changes. During winter thaws, people inspected their roofs carefully and added extra sod or packed soil wherever leaks appeared. Repairs became part of the rhythm of living in an earthen house. You lift your gaze toward the ceiling beams again. The wood remains dry for the moment, protected by the thick layer of soil above it. That layer, heavy though it may seem, often helps slow the melting process by insulating the snow resting on top. In many ways, the roof behaved almost like a blanket over the house. Still water always searches patiently for the easiest path downward. A quiet little detail recorded in a Nebraska Homesteaders journal, mentions how some families occasionally climbed onto their roofs during warmer winter afternoons to smooth snow away from trouble spots. They packed extra grass or mud into thin areas, strengthening the barrier, before nightfall froze everything solid again. Imagine standing on your own roof, balancing carefully on a patch of frozen prairie earth while wind sweeps across the plains. Frontier home repair required both courage and balance. Inside the house, the stove continues radiating warmth, adding its own contribution to the melting process. Heat rises slowly towards the ceiling, warming the soil above and encouraging tiny streams of water to form. You move another small bowl beneath a new drip forming near the corner of the room. The quiet tapping continues, yet even this small inconvenience carries a strange sense of comfort. The dripping water proves that temperatures have risen slightly, if only for a short while. Winter has loosened its grip, even if just for an afternoon. Some historians continue discussing how settlers perceived these brief thaws during long prairie winters. While melting snow could create mess and maintenance work inside sod houses, it also offered psychological relief, a reminder that the cold season did not last forever. You sit down again near the stove and listen to the rhythm of water drops striking metal. Tap! Ping! Tap! Ping! Outside, the prairie remains vast and quiet beneath its blanket of melting snow. The wind moves gently across the plains, carrying hints of warmer air from distant regions. Inside the sod house, the roof works patiently to manage the shifting weather. Soil absorbs moisture. Grass roots hold the structure together. Small leaks appear and disappear as the temperature changes. Living beneath a roof made from earth means accepting that nature remains part of your home. You glance once more at the pan catching water on the floor. Soon the temperature will fall again after sunset, freezing the roof solid and ending the dripping until the next thaw arrives. Until then, the soft sound of melting snow becomes part of the quiet music inside your prairie shelter. By midday, the warmth from the stove and the brief winter thaw have changed the character of the floor beneath your feet. What was firm, dusty earth yesterday now feels slightly softer in places. When you step near the doorway, your boot presses a shallow mark into the packed soil. It is not mud exactly, but the ground has begun to loosen. Living with a dirt floor means accepting that the ground itself participates in daily life. You sweep a hand across the surface near the table and watch a faint cloud of dust rise into the air. The particles drift slowly downward again, settling back into the same floor that produced them. On dry days, the floor becomes powdery. On damp days, it grows soft, and occasionally during thawing weather like this, it tries to do both at once. Early settlement records describe how dirt floors were extremely common in sod houses during the first years of prairie homesteading. Lumber remained difficult to obtain across much of the Great Plains, especially before railroads expanded into the region. Until wooden planks became easier to purchase, the ground itself served as flooring in many frontier homes. You walk slowly across the room, studying the surface more closely. Footprints from yesterday still linger faintly near the stove. The heat there keeps the soil dry, leaving pale impressions like quiet echoes of movement. Closer to the door, the ground darkens slightly where moisture has worked its way upward. It's a subtle map of the room's daily activity. Families living in sod houses learn to manage these floors with simple tools. A broom made from bundled grass or twigs often rested near the door, ready to sweep away loose dust. Regular sweeping helped keep the room tidy, even though the floor remained made of earth. You pick up the broom, leaning against the wall, and push it gently across the ground. The sound is soft and steady. Dust gathers slowly into small lines that you guide toward the doorway. When you finish, the surface looks slightly smoother, though it will not remain that way for long. The prairie always finds ways to return its soil to the room. A faint breeze slips through the doorframe when you open it briefly to shake the broom outside. The cold air carries the smell of snow and distant grass, a reminder that the landscape surrounding the house remains vast and open. You step back inside and close the door again. The floor near the entrance already shows a thin scattering of fresh dust from your boots. Keeping a dirt floor clean required patience rather than perfection. Many families accepted that a certain amount of soil would always travel inside with them. Some settlers even sprinkled water lightly across the floor to keep dust from rising too easily. Damp soil held together better and produced fewer drifting particles when people walked across it. You imagine someone performing that small ritual early each morning, carrying a bucket of water from a nearby well or barrel and spreading a light splash across the ground. Another curious detail appears in several prairie diaries describing how families sometimes packed fresh clay across their dirt floors to strengthen the surface. When the clay dried, it formed a smoother and slightly firmer layer that resisted footprints more effectively than loose soil. Over time, these efforts created floors that were surprisingly durable. You walk toward the bed and sit for a moment studying the room again. The floor may not be elegant, but it holds the quiet history of every step taken here. Footprints from boots, the faint drag of chairs, the occasional mark from a dropped tool. All of it remains recorded in the earth beneath your feet. That connection between house and ground shape daily routines in subtle ways. Researchers studying frontier living conditions often note that sod houses blurred the boundary between indoors and outdoors. Unlike wooden homes built on raised foundations, these structures rested directly on the prairie soil. The land itself continued living within the house. Dust travelled in. Moisture crept upward toward afterthaws. Small insects occasionally explored the floor before disappearing again into unseen spaces between sod bricks. You stand and take a few slow steps toward the stove. The warmth there keeps the surrounding ground firm and dry. It almost feels like a small island of stability within the room. Boots leave lighter impressions near the fire because the soil holds together better under steady heat. That tiny difference becomes noticeable after living here for a while. Another little anecdote recorded by a Kansas homesteader describes how some families eventually covered portions of their dirt floors with simple rugs or woven mats. These coverings provided extra comfort underfoot and helped trap loose dust during daily activities. Even a narrow strip of fabric across the ground could transform part of the room into a more comfortable living space. You glance around the house again. The table, the bed, the stove, the shelves along the wall. Everything sits directly on the prairie soil, each object anchored by the gravity rather than nails or foundations. Outside, the snow continues melting slowly beneath pale sunlight. Inside the sod house, the floor adjusts quietly to changing conditions, shifting between dry firmness and gentle softness depending on the weather. Life here requires a certain flexibility. You cannot demand that the floor behave exactly the same every day. Instead, you learn its moods and adapt your movements accordingly. Some historians still discuss how these small adaptations shape settlers' experiences on the prairie. Living inside structures made from earth meant accepting a closer relationship with the natural environment than many families had known before. The house protected you, but it never fully separated you from the land around it. You sweep the floor one last time and lean the broom back against the wall. The dust settles. The room grows quiet again. Beneath your feet, the prairie soil remains exactly where it has always been, supporting both the house above it and the small life unfolding inside these thick earthen walls. Not long after the floor dries and the quiet of the afternoon settles back over the house, you begin to notice another small reality of living in a home made partly from earth. You are not the only creature who appreciates its warmth. It begins with a soft sound near the corner of the room. At first, it is barely noticeable, something between a scratch and a faint shuffle. You pause while stirring the pot on the stove and listen more carefully. There it is again, a tiny movement inside the wall. You lean back in the chair and glance toward the corner where the sound came from. The sod bricks remain stacked exactly as they were before, thick layers of soil bound together by tangled grass roots. Yet within that dense wall lies a network of tiny spaces and tunnels created by the natural structure of the earth. Those spaces occasionally attract visitors. Frontier accounts written by prairie settlers often mention that mice were among the most frequent guests inside sod houses. The thick earthen walls provided insulation and shelter from the cold, making them appealing hiding places during winter. For a small animal facing prairie winds and freezing temperatures, the walls of a sod house probably seemed like an excellent apartment building. You hear the faint rustle again. This time it travels a few inches along the wall before stopping. You smile quietly. A single mouse exploring the wall is hardly surprising. In fact, many families living on the plains became quite familiar with these tiny neighbours. Grain stored inside homes naturally attracted them, and the sod bricks themselves made perfect passageways for small creatures. You walk slowly toward the corner and crouch beside the wall. The scratching sound stops immediately. Somewhere behind the packed soil, a small creature has paused to listen just as carefully as you have. One amusing observation preserved in a Nebraska homesteader's diary describes how prairie mice sometimes tunneled through the walls and appeared suddenly inside the room itself. The writer noted that these unexpected arrivals occasionally startled both the family and the mouse equally. Imagine sitting quietly at the table only to see a tiny whiskered face emerge from the wall beside you. Life on the frontier included moments like that. You return to the stove and stir the pot again. The warmth of the fire continues spreading slowly across the room, creating an inviting environment not just for people, but for other living things as well. The prairie outside may be cold and exposed, but inside this little house the temperature is far more comfortable. It's no wonder small animals occasionally try to join you. Of course, settlers did not simply ignore these guests. Many families kept simple traps to prevent mice from multiplying too quickly. Grain supplies were valuable, and protecting them became part of daily household management. A small wooden trap placed near the wall often solved the problem quietly, yet complete prevention proved nearly impossible. Researchers studying prairie homesteads often point out that sod houses naturally allowed small wildlife to interact with human spaces more easily than wooden buildings did. The very material that made the house sturdy and insulated also created countless tiny hiding places. You glance again toward the wall. The scratching sound has faded for now. Perhaps the mouse has retreated deeper into the maze of roots and soil within the bricks. Or perhaps it's simply decided that the room feels a bit too lively at the moment. Either way, you suspect it will return later. Mice were not the only visitors. Spiders occasionally built delicate webs along the ceiling beams, taking advantage of the quiet corners near the roof. Beetles sometimes wandered across the floor before disappearing beneath furniture. One particularly curious recollection from a Kansas settler mentions that frogs occasionally appeared inside sod houses after heavy rainstorms. The writer never fully explained how they arrived, but suspected they travelled through tiny openings in the damp earth walls. A house made from soil remained surprisingly connected to the living landscape outside. You move toward the table again and sit down. The faint afternoon light from the window stretches across the dirt floor, illuminating tiny patterns left by your earlier sweeping. Everything appears calm once more. Outside, the prairie lies silent beneath its winter ski. Inside the house, the stove hums softly, holding warmth in the small space. The presence of small animals may seem inconvenient at times, but it also reflects something important about sod houses. These homes were not sealed structures designed to isolate people completely from nature. Instead, they existed as part of the prairie ecosystem itself. Modern historians continue discussing how this closeness shaped daily frontier experiences. Living inside earthen structures meant sharing space at least occasionally with the smaller inhabitants of the plains. You lean back in your chair and listen again. No scratching now. Just the quiet breathing of the stove and the distant whisper of wind beyond the thick sod walls. Somewhere within those walls, a tiny mouse may still be exploring its hidden tunnels, unaware that it shares the house with you. And in a strange way, that small presence makes the house feel even more connected to the prairie surrounding it. After all, when your shelter is built from the very soil beneath your feet, it is only natural that a few other prairie residents might decide to move in as well. Evening arrives again with its familiar quiet. The prairie outside fades gradually from pale winter grey into the deeper blues of approaching night. Inside the sod house, the stove continues glowing softly, its steady warmth filling the room with a calm that feels almost protective. You sit near the table and notice how still everything has become. One of the most surprising things about the prairie during winter is not always the wind or the cold. It is the silence. At first, that silence feels unusual. People who arrive from towns or wooded regions often expect the outdoors to carry constant sound, rustling leaves, flowing water, distant traffic of human life. But the open plains behave differently. Once the wind settles, the prairie can grow astonishingly quiet. You move toward the window and look outside. Snow stretches across the land in a pale sheet, reflecting the last traces of twilight. The horizon looks enormous and empty. No hills interrupt the view. No forests stand between you and the distance. The world feels very wide. Written descriptions from settlers often remark on this immense openness. Many pioneers commented that the prairie sky seemed larger than anywhere they had lived before. Without trees or mountains to frame it, the sky dominates the landscape completely. The result can feel peaceful or slightly overwhelming. You lean your shoulder gently against the wall and listen. Inside the sod house, the silence deepens. The thick earth walls soften outside sounds so effectively that even the faint wind moving across the plains becomes little more than a distant murmur. The stove crackles softly. A small ember shifts inside the firebuoko, and then everything grows still again. This quiet shapes daily life in ways many settlers did not expect. People accustomed to busier environments sometimes wrote about the prairie's silence with a mixture of admiration and unease. One woman living on a Nebraska homestead recorded in her journal that the quiet night sometimes felt so complete she could hear the ticking of her own watch from across the room. Imagine living in a place where the smallest sound travels clearly through the air. You sit down again and rest your hands on the table. The quiet allows your senses to notice small details that might otherwise disappear. The faint warmth rising from the stove, the subtle creak of the wooden beams above as they adjust to changing temperatures. Even the sound of your own breathing becomes noticeable. Frontier diaries reveal that many settlers gradually grew accustomed to this silence. Over time it became part of the rhythm of prairie life, something almost comforting after the long labour of the day. Still, not everyone found it easy. Researchers examining pioneer letters often observed that isolation played a powerful role in shaping the emotional experience of homesteading. Families sometimes lived miles apart from their nearest neighbours, separated by wide stretches of open land. During winter, travel between homes became even more difficult. Snow, wind, and freezing temperatures discouraged unnecessary journeys. As a result, evenings like this often passed without seeing another person beyond your household. The sod house became a small island of human life in an enormous landscape. You glance toward the window again. Darkness now covers most of the prairie. Though faint moonlight reflects softly from the snow, the wide plain looks almost endless beneath the quiet ski. Somewhere far away, a sound drifts across the land. A coyote calling. The voice rises slowly, stretching through the cold air before fading again into the distance. It does not feel threatening. Instead, it simply reminds you that the prairie remains alive beyond the walls of your home. Animals often provided the only nighttime sounds across these vast plains. You lean back in your chair and listen as the silence returns. Another small note preserved in prairie memoirs mentions how settlers sometimes learned to identify distant sounds with surprising accuracy. The cry of a coyote, the barking of a neighbour's dog, or the creaking wheels of a wagon could travel long distances across open land. Without trees or buildings to block the sound, even faint noises carried clearly through the cold air. Tonight, however, the prairie offers very little disturbance. Just quiet. You stand and walk slowly around the room, feeling the warmth of the stove against the cool air near the walls. The sod bricks continue performing their steady work, insulating the house from the cold night outside. The earthen walls hold warmth in the same patient way the prairie holds its roots. Modern historians sometimes reflect on how this silence shaped the mental landscape of frontier life. For some settlers, the quiet provided a sense of peace and reflection. For others, it emphasized the distance separating them from friends and family left behind in the east. Both experiences likely existed side by side. You return to the table and sit again. The stove glows gently beside you. The room remains still. Outside, the prairie lies beneath a quiet sky full of faint stars, its enormous silence stretching across miles of frozen grassland. Inside the sod house, the calm feels complete, wrapping the small room in a peaceful stillness that makes the vast winter prairie beyond the walls seem just a little less lonely. After several evenings like this, as you begin to recognize something deeper about life on the prairie, the quiet is not the only challenge. It is the distance. You step outside for a moment just before dusk, pulling your coat tightly around you as a cold air slides across the open land. The snow beneath your boots crunches softly while the wind carries a thin veil of powder across the surface. You look toward the horizon. Nothing interrupts the view. Miles of prairie stretch outward in every direction, smooth and pale beneath the fading winter light. Somewhere out there, other families live in houses very much like yours, each one surrounded by its own small claim of land. But from here you cannot see them. The nearest neighbour might live a mile away, or 5, or more. Land records from the Homestead Act period reveal just how widely scattered prairie families could be. Each homestead often covered 160 acres or more, and those plots spread across enormous areas of open land. Even when several families lived in the same region, their houses might still sit far enough apart that no smoke from a chimney was visible on most days. The prairie gave settlers room to breathe. It also gave them room to feel alone. You stand for a moment watching the light fade across the snow. In summer, the distance might feel freeing, but during winter it becomes something else entirely. Cold winds and drifting snow make travel slower and more difficult. A simple visit to another household can turn into a long journey across frozen ground. You step back inside the sod house and close the door firmly behind you. The warmth from the stove greets you again. Inside this small room, the isolation becomes easier to ignore. The thick walls soften the wind, and the glow of the fire creates a sense of comfort that the wide prairie cannot provide. Yet the distance remains. Pioneer letters often describe how settlers coped with the loneliness of frontier life. Many families relied heavily on routines to structure their days. Chores, cooking, repairs, and reading by lamplight filled hours that might otherwise feel empty. Even simple tasks carried meaning. You sit down at the table and glance toward the window again. Darkness has nearly covered the prairie now. Only the faint reflection of moonlight reveals the snow beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, another small house may hold a family sitting beside their own stove, listening to the same wind moving across the plains. You cannot see them, but they exist. That thought brings a certain comfort. One curious note from a homesteader's journal describes how some prairie families used lantern light as a signal during winter evenings. If neighbours lived close enough to see one another across the open land, they sometimes placed lamps in windows to show that all was well. A small glowing square of light could travel surprisingly far across the dark prairie. You imagine standing outside and spotting such a lantern flickering in the distance, a quiet reminder that someone else is there. Inside the house, the stove pops softly as a small piece of fuel shifts in the fire. The sound feels louder in the otherwise silent room. You lean back in your chair and stretch your arms slowly. Loneliness was a subject that appeared often in frontier diaries. Some settlers wrote about missing crowded streets and familiar neighbours from the towns they left behind. Others found peace in the solitude of the prairie, appreciating the freedom that wide open land offered. Researchers studying these writings still discuss how isolation affected different people in different ways. For some families, the quiet landscape strengthened bonds within the household itself. With few outside distractions, evenings often became times for conversation, reading, or shared work. The sod house may be small, but it becomes the centre of daily life. You walk slowly around the room again. The walls stand steady. The stove continues its quiet glow. The simple furniture waits patiently beneath the dim lamplight. Every object inside this house represents effort. The journey across the plains, the long days spent building shelter from prairie sod, the constant work required to maintain warmth and comfort through winter. These efforts give the room a quiet sense of accomplishment. Outside the prairie remains enormous and mostly empty, yet inside this small house a life continues unfolding. You move toward the window one more time. The night sky is filled with stars, now their light sharp and steady above the frozen plains. Without towns or cities nearby, the sky appears deeper than most people ever see. The stars seem close enough to touch. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, other homesteaders sit beneath the same sky, watching the same stars through their own windows, separated by miles of snow and grassy, yet connected by the shared experience of prairie life. You return to the stove and warm your hands beside the fire. The loneliness of the plains may never disappear completely, but the sod house provides something equally powerful: shelter, warmth, and a small centre of light in a vast winter landscape. A few days after the last snowfall, the quiet rhythm of prairie life brings a rare and welcome change. Someone is coming to visit. You notice the sign long before the person reaches the house. While standing near the window in the afternoon light, your eyes catch a faint movement far out across the pale prairie. At first, it looks like nothing more than a shifting speck against the snow. Then the shape grows slightly larger. A wagon. It moves slowly across the frozen ground, its dark outline rising and dipping gently with the uneven prairie. The horses pull steadily, their breath visible in the cold air as faint drifting clouds. Visitors on the winter prairie never appear suddenly. They arrive gradually, giving you plenty of time to notice their approach. You step outside and pull your coat tight around your shoulders while watching the distant wagon draw closer. The wind brushes softly across the snow, but today it carries less bite than usual. The sky above stretches pale and clear, offering one of those calm winter afternoons that settlers learn to appreciate. Journeys like this required patience. Frontier travel accounts frequently describe how winter slowed movement across the plains. Snowdrifts, frozen ground, and unpredictable weather all influenced how quickly a wagon could move between homesteads. Even short distances sometimes required hours of careful travel. The wagon continues its slow approach. Soon you can make out the figure of a driver sitting high on the seat, guiding the horses with steady hands. Behind the seat rests a small load covered with canvas, likely supplies or items being traded between neighbours. You recognise the visitor before the wagon even stops, a neighbour from several miles away. Out here, the word neighbour stretches across far greater distances than it might in a crowded town. Family is often considered anyone living within several miles part of their local community, and when winter limited travel, these visits became especially meaningful. The wagon creaks gently as it rolls to a stop near the house. Snow crunches beneath the horse's hooves while the driver climbs down with a stiff stretch. "Afternoon," he calls. You greet him warmly and help guide the horses toward a spot where they can rest. The animals stamp their feet against the frozen ground, grateful for the pause after a long journey. Visitors rarely arrived empty-handed. Your neighbour lifts a small wooden crate from the back of the wagon and carries it towards the house. Inside you find several jars of preserved fruit and a small sack of flour. Trade between homesteads formed an important part of prairie life. Frontier store ledgers and settlement records show that neighbours frequently exchanged food tools and supplies during visits. A family with extra preserved vegetables might trade them for flour, while another might share spare fuel or livestock feed. The prairie demanded cooperation. You invite your neighbour inside the sod house where the warmth of the stove greets him immediately. He removes his gloves and holds his hands near the fire, letting the heat slowly return to his fingers. The small room suddenly feels livelier. Conversations begin easily in spaces like this. News travels slowly across the prairie, so each visitor brings stories from the surrounding land. You sit at the table while he describes recent weather, a broken wagon axle repaired last week, and rumours that another family plans to claim land several miles to the south. Even simple news feels valuable out here. One charming detail preserved in several pioneer memoirs mentions how winter visits often lasted longer than expected. When travel required hours across open prairie, neighbours rarely rushed their time together. A quick visit could easily stretch into an afternoon of conversation beside the stove. Sometimes guests stayed the night if darkness arrived before they could return safely. You pour 2 cups of warm broth and place one before your visitor. Steam rises from the cups while the stove continues its steady work in the background. The room feels warmer now, not only from the fire but from the presence of another person. Human voices fill the quiet that once surrounded the house. Your neighbour glances around the sod walls with an approving nod. He remarks on how sturdy the structure looks, noting the thickness of the bricks and the careful arrangement of the roof beams. Many settlers shared advice about building techniques during these visits. Small improvements learned by one family often spread quickly through conversation. Modern historians studying frontier communities frequently emphasize how important these exchanges were. Knowledge about construction, farming, and survival moved between households through informal gatherings like this one. A tip about sealing roof leaks or improving stove efficiency might pass from neighbour to neighbour across many miles of prairie. You sit back and listen while your guest continues describing conditions at his homestead. Snowdrifts have piled heavily near his barn, and he spent 2 days clearing paths for the animals. Such stories feel familiar. Winter demanded effort from everyone living on the plains. Outside, the sun begins slipping lower toward the horizon. pale golden light stretches across the snow, turning the prairie into a field of glowing colour. Eventually your neighbour stands and pulls on his coat again. The journey home must begin before darkness deepens. You step outside together and help him secure the crate he brought earlier. The horses snort softly as he climbs back onto the wagon seat. With a final wave, he guides the team forward. The wagon creaks into motion once more, slowly shrinking into the distance as it crosses the snowy prairie. You remain standing beside the house for a moment, watching until the moving shape becomes a tiny dot against the wide horizon. Visits like that may seem ordinary, yet they carry a quiet importance on the frontier. Inside the sod house, the stove still glows warmly. The room returns to its familiar stillness. But for a little while, the prairie felt slightly less empty. Not every experience inside a sod house looks the same to everyone living there. For adults, the little earthen home often represents work responsibility and the constant effort required to survive prairie winters. But for children, the house can appear quite different. To them, it's simply home. You notice this difference most clearly when you imagine how a child might move through the room. Where an adult sees narrow space and practical furniture, a child notices possibilities. The packed dirt floor becomes a place for games. The thick sod walls become mysterious surfaces filled with shapes and patterns. Even the low ceiling beams feel like something that might invite climbing if no one is watching too closely. Families living on prairie homesteads often included several children, and their presence changed the rhythm of daily life inside these small houses. Letters written by pioneer parents frequently mention how youngsters adapted to frontier conditions with remarkable energy. They learned quickly that winter did not mean inactivity. You sit near the stove and imagine a child kneeling on the floor beside the warm iron surface, arranging small objects into imaginary villages or fields. A wooden spoon might become a wagon. A stone from outside might represent a hill or mountain. A house made from earth offered plenty of materials for imagination. Historical census records from the late 19th century reveal that many prairie families were quite large. It was not unusual for households to include 4, 5, or even more children. In small sod houses, that meant everyone shared the same limited space. Beds were often crowded. Sleeping arrangements required creativity. Yet many children who later wrote about their frontier childhoods remembered those homes with surprising fondness. You glance toward the wall where faint patterns of grass roots run through the soil. To a child, those twisting lines might resemble maps, rivers, or secret pathways hidden within the walls. The natural textures of sod bricks created shapes that invited curiosity. One small anecdote preserved in a Kansas pioneer memoir describes how children sometimes searched the walls for interesting stones or fossils hidden within the soil blocks. Occasionally they discovered tiny shells or fragments of ancient rock embedded in the prairie earth. Imagine realizing that your living room wall contains pieces of history far older than the house itself. You smile slightly at the thought. Children also played outside whenever weather allowed, even during winter. Snow drifting across the prairie became an enormous playground. Hills created by windblown drifts offered perfect places for sliding or climbing. Of course, parents watched the weather carefully. The prairie could change quickly and safety remained a constant concern. Still, young people often found ways to enjoy the environment surrounding them. Inside the sod house, evenings brought a different kind of activity. With the stove glowing warmly in the centre of the room, families sometimes gathered together for quiet entertainment. Reading aloud from a book or telling stories passed down through generations helped fill long winter nights. For children especially, these moments carried magic. The dim light from a lamp or the candle cast shadows along the earthen walls, while voices filled the small room with tales of distant places and adventures. You lean back slightly in your chair and imagine the sound of laughter rising toward the low ceiling. Despite the hardships of frontier life, these shared evenings created strong family bonds. Researchers studying pioneer childhoods often note that children growing up on the plains developed independence at an early age. Helping with chores, caring for animals, and assisting with household work became part of daily routines. Yet that responsibility did not eliminate childhood. Did you show the curiosity? Another charming detail appears in a letter written by a young girl living on a Nebraska homestead in the 1880s. She described how her brother once tried planting a handful of seeds directly into a crack in the sod wall, hoping to grow a tiny indoor garden. The experiment did not succeed, but the idea itself reveals how closely children connected their homes to the land surrounding them. When your house is made from soil and grass, the boundary between indoors and outdoors feels wonderfully thin. You stand and walk slowly around the room again. The sod walls remain steady and quiet, holding the warmth of the stove while night begins settling across the prairie outside. It is easy to imagine how a child might see adventure in every corner of this small space. The wooden chest becomes a treasure box. The ladder to the roof might look like a path to the sky. Even the scratching sound of a mouse inside the wall could transform into a mysterious creature living within the house. Modern historians sometimes explore how frontier children viewed sod houses differently than adults did. While parents focused on survival and hard work, children often experienced the prairie as a landscape of exploration. The same open land that felt lonely to adults sometimes appeared exciting and full of possibility to younger eyes. You pause near the window and look outside. The prairie stretches wide and quiet beneath the evening sky. Inside the sod house, the warmth continues spreading gently through the room, creating a safe and steady place where family life unfolds even during the coldest months of winter. For children growing up here, these thick earthen walls were not strange or temporary. They were simply the walls of home. Morning arrives with the familiar routine of winter chores waiting quietly outside the door. You step out of the sod house and feel the cold greet you immediately. The air carries that sharp clarity that only appears during the heart of prairie winter. Snow crunches beneath your boots as you walk toward the small area where water barrels and tools stand near the house. Today's task may seem simple: laundry. But winter on the prairie transforms even ordinary chores into small challenges. You lift the lid from the water barrel and peer inside. A thin sheet of ice has formed across the surface overnight. It glitters faintly beneath the morning light like fragile glass. This happens often during cold months. Many settlers kept barrels or buckets of water inside sheltered areas near their homes, but freezing temperatures could still turn the surface solid by morning. Breaking that thin ice became part of the day's routine. You tap the surface gently with a wooden stick until the ice cracks and separates. Cold water appeared beneath. Practical household guides printed during the late 19th century often advised prairie families to store water carefully during winter. Carrying water long distances from wells or streams could become exhausting if repeated too frequently in freezing weather. Having a nearby supply saved both time and energy. You carry a bucket inside the sod house and set it beside the stove. Soon the warmth from the fire begins softening the chill in the water. Steam rises faintly as the temperature slowly climbs. Laundry requires patience here. Modern washing machines would seem almost magical to prairie settlers. Every piece of clothing had to be cleaned by hand using simple tools. Soap water and careful scrubbing did most of the work. You place a small metal basin near the stove and pour warm water into it. The steam curls upward into the air, bringing a brief moment of comfort to the cold room. You dip a cloth into the basin and begin working slowly, rubbing fabric against the soap until a thin lather appears. Outside, the prairie remains silent beneath the pale winter sky. Inside the small house, the quiet rhythm of washing fills the room. Frontier household manuals from the 1870s often described washing clothing as one of the most time-consuming chores in rural homes. Without mechanical tools, cleaning even a small load of laundry required steady effort. During winter, the task became even more complicated. Water cooled quickly once removed from the stove's warmth. If laundry was hung outdoors, the wet fabric could freeze within minutes. Settlers had to choose carefully when and where they dried their clothing. You glance toward the ceiling beams, where a simple line of rope stretches from one side of the room to the other. Indoor drying lines like this appeared in many sod houses during winter months. Hanging garments near the stove allowed them to dry slowly without freezing solid in the cold air outside. You wring out a shirt and hang it carefully on the rope. Drops of water fall quietly onto the dirt floor below. Within minutes, the fabric begins releasing faint warmth into the room as the stove dries it gently. One curious story recorded in a pioneer diary describes what happened when a family attempted to dry clothing outside during extremely cold weather. According to the writer, the garments froze so stiff that they stood upright on the line like wooden boards. Bringing them inside required thawing them slowly beside the stove before they could even be folded. You imagine a row of frozen shirts standing proudly in the wind like silent soldiers. Life on the prairie produced many moments like that. You continue washing, slowly dipping each piece of clothing into the basin before scrubbing it clean. The work requires steady hands, but offers a quiet sense of satisfaction as the pile of laundry gradually shrinks. Researchers studying frontier households often point out how essential these daily chores were to maintaining comfort inside small homes. Clean clothing, dry blankets, and fresh linens helped families stay healthy during long winters. Without regular washing, damp garments could quickly become unpleasant or even dangerous in freezing conditions. You hang another shirt beside the stove and pause to warm your hands. The air inside the house now carries the scent of soap mixed with the earthy smell of the sod walls. Outside, the snow continues reflecting the pale winter sunlight. Despite the cold, there is something calming about this routine. You look around the room and notice the line of drying clothes stretching gently between the beams. Each piece sways slightly in the warm air rising from the stove. The sod house has quietly transformed into a small laundry room. Yet the work does not feel burdensome. Instead, it becomes another part of the steady rhythm that shapes life on the prairie. Chores fill the hours of winter days, creating structure within the wide, quiet landscape outside. Modern historians sometimes discuss how tasks like washing, cooking, and repairing clothing form the backbone of daily frontier life. These small acts of maintenance kept families comfortable and prepared for the next challenge. You finish the final piece of laundry and hang it beside the others. Steam rises softly into the room. The stove continues glowing steadily. Outside, the prairie stretches cold and endless beneath the winter sky. Inside the sod house, the quiet work of the morning fades into calm, leaving behind the gentle warmth of drying clothes and the peaceful rhythm of another day unfolding within these earthen walls. Later in the winter, after many quiet weeks inside the sod house, another concern begins quietly occupying your thoughts. Fire. At first, it may seem strange to worry about fire in a house built mostly from earth. The thick sod walls do not burn the way wooden boards do, and the soil surrounding the structure offers a natural barrier against flames. Yet the danger still exists. You stand beside the stove and watch the small fire glowing steadily inside its iron chamber. The warmth it provides has become a constant companion during the long prairie winter. Without it, the house would quickly grow cold and uncomfortable. But every flame deserves respect. You open the stove door carefully and place another piece of fuel onto the embers. Sparks flicker briefly before settling into a steady glow. The stovepipe carries smoke upward through the roof and into the wide prairie sky. That narrow metal pipe must pass through several layers of sodgrass and soil before reaching open air. If installed poorly, it could allow heat to build where it should not. Homestead construction guides printed in the late 19th century often advise settlers to reinforce the area around stovepipes with extra care. Many builders surrounded the pipe with clay or metal collars to prevent sparks or heat from reaching nearby plant roots within the sod roof. It was a simple precaution that could prevent serious trouble. You step back and glance upward toward the ceiling, where the pipe disappears through the earthen layers above. Everything appears secure today. The beam surrounding the pipe remains dry and sturdy with no sign of smoke or damage. Still, caution remains wise. Outside the prairie, wind has begun rising again, pushing loose snow across the ground in pale streaks. The sound reaches the house as a soft rushing whisper against the thick walls. Inside the room, the fire continues burning calmly. One small but fascinating detail appears in several prairie homestead accounts describing how settlers often kept buckets of sand or water nearby during winter. These supplies could be used quickly if sparks escaped the stove or if a small fire began near the roof. Even a house built from earth still contained wooden beams, furniture and bedding that could catch fire if a flame spread unexpectedly. Preparedness became a quiet habit of frontier life. You move toward the door and glance outside. The prairie stretches plummed and white beneath a sky filled with drifting clouds. Snow has smoothed the land into gentle waves of pale colour. In this cold season, the idea of fire spreading across the plains may seem unlikely. Yet history shows that prairie fires could occur during almost any season when dry grass and strong wind combined. Travellers crossing the plains sometimes wrote about vast grass fires that moved like glowing rivers across the land. The flames consume dry vegetation, quickly leaving blackened ground behind them. These fires frightened early settlers. However, winter offered a certain level of protection. Snow and frozen soil reduced the risk dramatically, making large prairie fires far less common during the coldest months. Even so, families remained alert to the possibility of sparks escaping from chimneys during windy weather. You return inside and close the door again. The warmth of the stove greets you as the room settles back into its familiar quiet. The iron surface radiates steady heat while the fire inside crackles softly. Maintaining that fire requires constant attention. Fuel must be added carefully. Ashes must be cleared regularly so air can circulate through the burning coals. A poorly maintained stove could smoke heavily or allow embers to spill onto the floor. Frontier household manuals often included detailed instructions for managing indoor stoves safely. Many families learned these lessons through experience rather than formal training. The prairie rewarded careful habits. You lean down and brush a few loose ashes away from the stove door before closing it firmly. The fire continues glowing, contained within its iron chamber. Another interesting observation appears in a memoir written by a Dakota Territory settler who described how families sometimes placed metal sheets or flat stones beneath their stoves. These surfaces helped protect dirt floors from stray embers that might fall when the door opened. Small adjustments like that made everyday life safer. You sit down again at the table and listen to the quiet sound of the stove. The warmth spreads slowly through the sod walls, creating a gentle balance between heat and cold inside the house. Outside, the wind continues its restless journey across the plains, but the thick earthen structure absorbs much of its force. Modern historians who study prairie homesteads often point out that sod houses possessed an unexpected advantage when it came to fire. While wooden cabins could burn rapidly if flames spread, the heavy soil bricks of sod homes resisted fire naturally. The structure itself provided protection. Of course, that protection did not eliminate every risk. The roof beams, furniture, bedding, and stored supplies inside the house still required care. Fire remained both a life-saving tool and a responsibility. You glance once more at the stove. Its soft orange glow reflects gently across the walls, illuminating the tangled roots within the sod bricks. Outside the prairie, winter continues drifting across the land. Inside the sod house, the fire burns quietly, providing warmth and comfort, while reminding you that even the most useful tools demand respect and watchful attention. There are ordinary winter days on the prairie, and then there are the days when the sky decides to remind you who truly controls this land. You sense it before the storm even arrives. The air changes first, it grows heavier, quieter, almost expectant. The wind that usually wanders across the plains pauses for a while, as if gathering strength somewhere beyond the horizon. You step outside the sod house and scan the wide prairie. Far to the north, the sky carries a darker band of grey. It stretches low across the horizon, spreading slowly like ink through water. The clouds move in a steady line, thick and heavy with snow. A blizzard is coming. Travel journals from settlers crossing the Great Plains often describe how storms could appear suddenly during winter months. With little to block the movement of weather systems, strong winds and snow sometimes swept across hundreds of miles of open land. You watch the sky for a moment longer. The dark band grows wider. Time to prepare. Inside the sod house, the stove continues glowing softly, but the quiet comfort of the room will soon face a serious test. Storms on the prairie do not behave politely. They arrive with force and persistence, sometimes lasting for hours or even days. You begin checking small details around the house. The door closes tightly against its frame. You push gently against it to make sure the latch holds firmly. A strong wind can rattle loose boards if they are not secured. Next, you inspect the window. The glass looks solid, though frost gathers round its edges. Some settlers covered their windows with extra cloth during storms to reduce drafts. The sod walls already provide strong insulation, but every little precaution helps when winter weather intensifies. Outside, the wind begins to return. At first, it moves quietly across the prairie, lifting small threads of snow from the ground. The drifting powder slides along the surface like pale smoke. Then the wind grows stronger. You step back inside and close the door again. Within minutes, the sound against the walls increases from a gentle whisper to a steady rushing roar. Snow strikes the side of the house with a faint rattling noise. The blizzard has arrived. Historical weather observations recorded at frontier settlements show that blizzards were among the most feared winter events on the Great Plains. Winds could reach remarkable speeds, driving snow horizontally through the air and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Travel during such storms became nearly impossible. You sit near the stove and listen to the rising sound outside. The wind presses against the sod walls with steady force. Yet the thick earth bricks respond exactly as they were designed to do. They remain still. Instead of shaking or creaking, the walls simply absorb the pressure. The heavy mass of soil and tangled grass roots holds firm against the wind. The roof above you also plays its part. Covered with thick layers of sod, it stays anchored against the storm. A lighter wooden roof might struggle under these conditions, but the prairie soil resting above your head provides extra weight that resists the lifting force of the wind. Another gust slams into the house. Snow taps sharply against the window. You glance outside but see very little now. The prairie has disappeared into a swirling white curtain. Wind drives snow across the land in dense waves that blur the horizon completely. Storms like this could transform the prairie within hours. One surprising account from a Nebraska homesteader describes a blizzard that buried fences, wagons, and even small outbuildings beneath enormous snowdrifts. When the storm finally ended, the landscape looked entirely different. Paths vanished, landmarks disappeared. He's disappeared. The prairie reshaped itself beneath layers of snow. Inside the sod house, the situation feels very different. The stove continues radiating warmth while the thick walls hold back the worst of the storm. The air inside the room remains calm despite the fury outside. You add another piece of fuel to the fire and close the stove door carefully. The small flame brightens, spreading gentle light across the earthen walls. Storms like this tested both buildings and people. Modern historians studying prairie settlement often emphasize how important shelter design was during severe weather. Sod houses proved surprisingly resilient against blizzards because their low shape and heavy construction resisted the powerful prairie winds. While life inside them could be uncomfortable at times, these earthen homes performed well when storms arrived. You lean back in the chair and listen to the wind. It roars across the prairie like a distant river, surging and fading in waves that continue hour after hour. Snow piles against the walls, gradually building protective drifts that insulate the house even further. For now, there is little to do but wait. You watch the stove glow steadily. The warm light flickers across the dirt floor and the simple furniture arranged around the room. The house feels small yet remarkably strong. Outside, the blizzard continues sweeping across the open plains, erasing the familiar landscape beneath clouds of swirling snow. Inside the sod house, you remain sheltered, surrounded by thick earthen walls that stand patiently against the storm. And while the prairie wind howls across miles of frozen land, this humble patch of soil, stacked into a house, holds firm, protecting the quiet warmth of the room within. When the blizzard finally releases its grip, the prairie greets you with a strange kind of stillness. The wind fades first. After hours of rushing noise against the sod walls, the silence feels almost startling. You wake in the early morning and notice immediately that something has changed. The stove still glows faintly from the embers you left banked overnight, but the usual whisper of wind outside has disappeared. You sit up and listen. Nothing. Just quiet. You step down onto the dirt floor and walk slowly toward the door. The metal latch feels cold beneath your fingers as you pull it open. At first, the door barely moves. A solid weight presses against it from the outside. You push again with your shoulder, and the door shifts a few inches before stopping. Snow packed tightly against the frame resists your effort. This is one of the most familiar scenes after a prairie blizzard. You step back and smile quietly. Time to dig out. Storm reports written by settlers across the Great Plains frequently mention how snowdrifts could pile several feet high against buildings overnight. Strong winds carried loose snow across the open land and dropped it wherever an obstacle slowed the air. A sod house made an excellent obstacle. You pull on your coat and grab the shovel resting near the wall. When you step outside, the landscape looks completely different from the one you saw before the storm. Snow covers everything. The prairie stretches smooth and bright beneath the morning sky, its surface shaped into gentle waves and ridges, by the powerful winds of the night before. Fences, paths, and familiar ground features have vanished beneath thick white drifts. Even the lower half of the sod house has disappeared into the snow. Only the upper walls and the roof remain clearly visible above the new surface of the prairie. You begin clearing snow from the doorway, pushing the shovel slowly through the packed drift. Each movement sends small clouds of powder drifting into the cold air. The work is steady but not unpleasant. Sunlight reflects strongly from the snow, turning the entire landscape bright enough to make you squint. The storm may have passed, but its work remains everywhere around you. Early agricultural reports from prairie settlements often noted how blizzards reshaped the land dramatically. Snow could gather in some places while leaving others nearly bare, depending on how the wind moved across the terrain. The result looked almost like a frozen ocean. You pause for a moment and glance across the plains. The sky has cleared completely now. Pale winter sunlight spreads across miles of open land, illuminating the smooth curves of fresh drifts. Somewhere beneath those drifts lie fences, grasses, and wagon tracks hidden until the next thaw. You return to the task of clearing the doorway. After several minutes of steady shoveling, the path begins to open. Snow piles beside the house in tall ridges as you move it aside. The thick sod walls stand firm behind you, barely affected by the storm. One charming recollection from a Dakota Territory settler describes how children sometimes use the huge drifts left by blizzards as natural slides. Once paths were cleared, youngsters climbed the snow piles beside their homes and slid down repeatedly until their boots filled with powder. For adults, however, the drifts mostly meant work. You continue shoveling until a narrow walkway extends several feet from the door. The cold air fills your lungs as you pause to rest for a moment, leaning on the handle of the shovel. The prairie looks peaceful now. Only the deep snow reveals the power of the storm that passed during the night. Inside the house, the stove continues burning quietly. You step back through the doorway and brush snow from your coat before closing the door again. The warmth of the room greets you immediately. That contrast between outside and inside becomes especially noticeable after storms like this. The sod walls hold steady temperatures far better than thinner wooden structures might. Researchers studying frontier housing often point out how effectively sod homes insulated against both wind and cold. The thick earthen bricks absorbed warmth from the stove and released it slowly, helping maintain a stable environment inside. You glance toward the window. Snow now rises almost halfway up the glass, creating a bright white barrier between the room and the outside world. Light still filters through, but the view beyond the house has been replaced by the smooth wall of the drift. For a while, the prairie remains hidden. You sit down beside the stove and warm your hands. The shovel leans against the wall, ready for more work later in the day. Clearing paths to water sources, barns, or nearby tools may take several hours once the snow settles completely. Blizzards never finish their work quickly, yet the house remains safe and steady. Outside, the storm has reshaped the prairie into a quiet frozen landscape. Inside the sod house, the warmth of the stove and the shelter of the thick earthen walls turn another challenging winter morning into a manageable part of life on the plains. After the storm has passed and the heavy work of clearing snow begins to settle into routine again, the prairie occasionally offers a small reward. Sunlight. It arrives quietly in the morning, slipping across the horizon in a pale golden band that spreads slowly across the frozen land. You notice it first through the window of the sod house, where the glass glows softly with reflected brightness. The storm clouds have vanished. Outside, the sky stretches wide and clear in pale winter blue that seems almost endless above the plains. You step outside and pause just beyond the doorway. The cold still bites sharply at your face, but the sunlight changes everything. Instead of the dim grey of storm clouds, the prairie now shines with the reflected light from the snow. Every drift sparkles faintly as the sun climbs higher. The land looks enormous and peaceful. Travellers who crossed the Great Plains during the 19th century often wrote about how striking these clear winter mornings could be. After days of storm and blowing snow, the sudden return of sunlight created landscapes that appeared bright enough to hurt the eyes. Many settlers quickly learned to squint or shade their vision when working outdoors in fresh snow. You take a few slow steps away from the house. The snow beneath your boots squeaks with a sound that only appears when temperatures remain well below freezing. The air feels crisp and dry, carrying the faint scent of frozen grass beneath the white surface. The sod house behind you looks almost sculpted into the landscape. Drifts still rise along its walls, forming smooth curves of snow that blend the structure into the prairie itself. From a distance, the house might resemble a small hill rather than a building. That quiet blending was something many homesteaders noticed. Some early visitors to the plains described sod houses as if they were natural features of the land rather than human creations. The same grasses and soil used to build the walls often covered the roof as well, allowing the structure to merge visually with its surroundings. You turn slowly in place and look across the open prairie. The storm erased many familiar details, but sunlight now reveals new shapes created by drifting snow. Long ridges curve gently across the land where wind piled snow during the night. The prairie looks almost like a frozen ocean. You walk a little farther from the house and feel the sunlight warming your coat just slightly. The warmth remains subtle, but after days of grey skies, even this small change feels welcome. Periods of bright winter sun often lifted the spirits of prairie settlers. Letters written by homesteading families frequently mention how valuable these clear days felt during long winters. Sunshine allowed people to work outdoors more comfortably and helped melt thin layers of ice around wells, barns and doorways. It also brought a sense of relief after violent storms. You pause and look back toward the sod house again. Smoke drifts gently from the stovepipe into the calm air above the roof. Without the strong wind of the blizzard, the smoke rises almost straight upward before fading into the pale sky. The scene feels peaceful. One curious recollection recorded in a pioneer memoir describes how some families used bright winter days to climb onto their sod roofs and inspect the condition of the soil blocks. Sunlight softened the surface slightly, allowing settlers to press loose grass or extra soil into thin spots where the wind had eroded the covering. Standing on the roof of your own house might sound unusual today, but for prairie settlers it was simply another practical chore. You return slowly toward the door. The sunlight follows you, casting long shadows across the snow. Your footsteps create a simple trail leading from the house out across the smooth white surface. For a moment, the prairie feels almost friendly, yet the environment still demands respect. Researchers studying prairie weather patterns often emphasize how quickly conditions could change across the Great Plains. A calm, sunny morning might give way to strong winds or falling snow by evening. Settlers learn not to trust the sky too easily. Still, days like this were worth the earth appreciating. You step back inside the sod house and close the door behind you. The warmth from the stove greets you immediately, mixing with the brightness now shining through the window. The interior of the room looks different when sunlight reaches the walls. The sod bricks appear warmer in colour. The tangled grass roots within the soil become easier to see. Even the dirt floor reflects faint golden light across its surface. The little house seems almost cheerful for a while. You sit beside the table and rest your hands near the stove, enjoying the quiet moment. Outside, the prairie stretches wide and brilliant beneath the winter sun. Inside the sod house, the warmth and light combine to create a rare feeling of comfort. Storms will return eventually. Cold nights will continue testing the strength of the walls. But for this one clear winter day, sunlight spreads gently across the prairie and reminds you that even the harshest landscape sometimes pauses to offer a moment of quiet beauty. As the bright winter afternoon slowly fades into evening, the sod house settles once again into its familiar rhythm. Outside, the last of the sunlight slides gently across the snow before disappearing beyond the horizon. The prairie turns pale blue and then silver beneath the rising moon. Inside, the stove continues its steady glow, spreading warmth through the quiet room. This is the hour when stories begin. You place another piece of fuel into the stove and sit down beside the bevel. The small flame inside the iron chamber crackles softly, sending flickering light across the walls. Shadows stretch along the sod bricks, shifting slowly as the fire breathes. Evenings like this often brought families together. Frontier life left little time for idle conversation during the busy daylight hours. Work filled most of the day. Animals needed tending, wood needed cutting, and endless small repairs demanded attention. But once darkness arrived and chores were finished, the house became a place for quieter moments. The stove formed the centre of that gathering. Settlers often arranged their chairs near the fire during winter nights, creating a warm circle within the room. The thick sod walls held the heat while the wind outside faded into the background. You lean back slightly and imagine the soft murmur of voices filling the house. Many prairie families owned only a few books, yet those books could become treasured companions during long winters. Reading aloud was a common evening activity, allowing everyone in the room to share the story together. Historical accounts written by settlers frequently describe these small gatherings around the stove. A single book might be read many times over the course of a winter, each chapter becoming familiar like an old friend. Yet stories did not always come from printed pages. Some came from memory. Parents and grandparents often carried stories with them when they travelled west. Tales from earlier homes, adventures from childhood, or family legends passed down through generations all found their way into prairie evenings. The dim light of a lantern or candle gave these stories a quiet magic. You glance toward the wall where the shadows of the stove flicker softly across the tangled roots of the sod bricks. Those twisting lines almost look like shapes themselves, as if the walls are listening carefully. One charming detail preserved in several homestead memoirs describes how children sometimes ask for the same stories again and again during winter nights. A tale about a long wagon journey or a clever animal might be repeated so often that every person in the room could recite parts of it from memory. Repetition never seemed to diminish the enjoyment. In fact, it often made the stories feel even warmer. You shift slightly in your chair and stretch your hands toward the stove. The iron surface glows faintly while the fire inside crackles with steady points. Outside the prairie, night grows deeper. Moonlight reflects from the snow, casting a soft glow across the frozen land. The wide open plains look almost luminous beneath the stars. Inside the sod house, the small circle of firelight feels wonderfully secure. Researchers studying frontier culture often emphasize how storytelling served an important role in prairie communities. With limited entertainment available, shared stories helped strengthen family bonds and pass along knowledge from one generation to the next. A story might teach a lesson about weather animals or survival on the plains without sounding like instruction at all. It simply felt like conversation. You glance toward the wooden chest beside the wall and imagine someone lifting its lid to retrieve a worn book. The pages might be slightly yellowed from age, the cover softened by years of handling. Yet each reading would still feel new. The quiet room becomes the stage for imagination. A journey across distant mountains, a ship sailing across the ocean, a clever hero solving impossible problems, all of it unfolding inside the small sod house while winter stretches endlessly beyond the walls. Another gentle crackle rises from the stove. You add another small piece of fuel and watch the flames brighten again. The warmth spreads slowly through the room, pushing back the chill that gathers near the floor. Even without books, many prairie evenings included music. Some families brought small instruments with them when they moved west. A fiddle or harmonica could transform a quiet night into something lively and joyful. Even simple humming or singing helped lift spirits during long winters. Music travelled easily through small rooms. You imagine a soft melody rising towards the low ceiling beams, mixing with the quiet crackle of the stove and the distant whisper of wind outside. These small moments of comfort helped settlers endure the challenges of frontier life. The sod house may have been built from rough blocks of earth, but inside its walls people created warmth in many ways. Fire! Conversation. Stories shared beside the stove. You lean back again and watch the shadows move along the walls. Outside the prairie remains vast and silent beneath the winter sky. Inside the sod house, the gentle glow of the fire and the quiet presence of shared stories turn another long evening into a moment of calm companionship within the endless prairie night. Morning brings another small reminder that a house made from earth never stops asking for attention. You notice it while standing near the wall beside the window. At first, it appears to be nothing more than a faint change in the colour of the soil, a slightly darker line running between two sod bricks. Then you see the gap. It is small, only a narrow crack where the blocks have shifted slightly during weeks of freezing and thawing. The prairie weather never stays completely still for long, and the materials of the house respond quietly to those changes. Living inside a sod house means understanding that maintenance is part of daily life. You run your fingers gently along the crack. A few grains of dry soil fall to the floor as you touch the surface. Nothing serious yet, But it will need repair. Frontier farming guides published during the late 19th century often included advice about maintaining sod houses. The authors explained that walls occasionally settled or dried unevenly over time, creating small openings between the bricks. The solution was usually simple. Fresh soil or clay pressed firmly into the gap could restore the wall's strength and keep cold air from slipping inside. You step outside and collect a small bucket of damp earth from a spot where sunlight has softened the frozen ground near the house. The soil feels heavy in your hands as you carry it back inside. The room remains warm from the stove. You kneel beside the wall and press a handful of the damp earth into the crack. The soil molds easily between the bricks, filling the space with a firm seal. When you smooth the surface with your palm, the repair blends almost perfectly with the surrounding wall. Soon the crack disappears completely. Settlers quickly became familiar with this kind of repair work. Sod houses required occasional patching because the materials used to build them were natural and constantly reacting to weather. Rain, snow, heat, and wind slowly changed the shape and texture of the soil blocks, but that same flexibility also made repairs so surprisingly easy. Instead of replacing boards or cutting new lumber, families could simply use the same earth that formed the original walls. You stand and brush a little dust from your hands. Another small task finished. One interesting observation preserved in a Kansas pioneer memoir mentions how some families kept a special pile of repair soil near their houses. Whenever a crack appeared in the wall or roof, they could quickly gather fresh material without searching for it across frozen ground. It was a simple solution that saved time during cold weather. You glance toward the ceiling beams where the sod roof rests above the wooden supports. The roof also required occasional attention. Wind sometimes loosened patches of grass or soil, especially after heavy storms. When warmer weather arrived, settlers often climbed carefully onto the roof to repair thin areas or add fresh sod where needed. The idea of standing on top of your own house might sound unusual today, yet it was a common practice on the prairie. The roof was strong enough to support a person's weight because it was essentially a thick layer of compacted soil. You move toward the stove and add another piece of fuel. The fire glows warmly as the room settles back into its quiet routine. Outside, the prairie stretches wide beneath the winter sky. Snow drifts gently across the open land while sunlight reflects softly from the frozen surface. Inside the sod house, the repaired wall stands smooth and solid once again. These small acts of maintenance gradually become part of daily life. Modern historians studying frontier architecture often point out that sod houses functioned less like finished buildings and more like living structures. Their materials continued changing with the environment, requiring occasional adjustments from the people living inside. Rather than seeing this as a flaw, many settlers simply accepted it as normal. You sit down near the table and study the room again. The walls hold firm. The stove glows quietly. The dirt floor remains steady beneath your boots. Every element of the house reflects the same basic principle. The prairie provided the materials. Human effort shaped them into shelter, and continued care keeps the structure strong. You glance toward the window where winter sunlight now brightens the room slightly. The small house feels peaceful in its simplicity. There are no elaborate decorations here, no polished wood panels or painted walls. Yet the thick sod bricks surrounding you carry a quiet reliability that many settlers came to appreciate deeply. Outside the prairie, wind begins moving again across the snow. Inside the sod house, the repaired wall stands ready to face whatever weather the plains decide to send next. As winter continues stretching across the prairie, a quiet thought begins appearing more often in the back of your mind. Someday perhaps this house will not be made from earth. You sit near the stove one evening and study the sod walls around you. The thick bricks have served well through storms, wind, and cold nights. The roof holds steady beneath its covering of grass and soil. The little house has proven itself stronger than it first appeared. Still, many settlers arrived on the plains with a different kind of home in mind, a wooden house. The idea appears often in letters written by prairie families during the late 19th century. Early homesteaders frequently built sod houses as their first shelter simply because the materials were available immediately. Timber, on the other hand, required time, money, and transportation. Trees were scarce across much of the Great Plains. Without nearby forests, settlers depended on lumber shipped by railroads or hauled from distant river valleys. During the earliest years of settlement, those resources were not always easy to obtain. So the prairie itself became the building material. You lean back slightly in your chair and run your eyes along the wall beside the window. The tangled roots inside the sod bricks create delicate patterns across the soil surface. When sunlight touches them just right, they almost resemble woven fabric. The house may be simple, but it carries a certain quiet beauty. Even so, many families quietly dreamed of something more permanent. Newspaper advertisements and homestead guides from the period often encouraged settlers to view sod houses as temporary shelters. The expectation was that once farms became productive and railroads expanded, wooden homes would eventually replace the earthen structures. That process sometimes took years. You glanced toward the ceiling beams supporting the roof. Those beams were likely hauled from far away, perhaps carried by wagon across miles of prairie before arriving here. Lumber remained precious enough that every piece had been carefully chosen. If enough timber eventually reached this region, perhaps a new house could rise beside this one. One interesting story, preserved in a Nebraska Homesteaders memoir, describes how a family continued living in their sod house even after building a new wooden home nearby. According to the writer, the sod house stayed cooler during summer and warmer during winter, making it surprisingly comfortable long after its replacement was finished. The old house became a storage building, but it remained useful. You smile slightly at the thought, perhaps that these humble structures were better than many settlers first believed. The fire crackles softly in the stove as you add another piece of fuel. The iron surface glows gently while warmth spreads through the room. Outside, the prairie night settles quietly across the frozen land. Inside the sod house, the air remains calm and steady. Modern historians who study prairie settlement often discuss how attitudes toward sod houses changed over time. Early settlers sometimes considered them crude or temporary, but later generations began recognizing their practical advantages. The thick earthen walls provided excellent insulation. The low shape resisted strong prairie winds, and repairs required little more than the soil beneath your feet. Some scholars suggest that if more timber had been available during the early years of settlement, sod houses might never have become so common. Others believe settlers would still have used them because they were quick to build and well suited to the prairie environment. Either way, these homes played an important role in the story of the Great Plains. You stand and walk slowly across the room, noticing how familiar the space has become. The stove near the center, the bed against the wall, the table where meals and conversations fill the quiet evenings. The sod house may have begun as a temporary shelter, but over time it has grown into something more meaningful. It has become home. Outside, the sky fills with stars above the frozen prairie. Their light reflects softly from the snow, creating a pale glow that reaches even the small window of the house. You pause beside the glass and look out across the land. Someday a wooden house might stand here, perhaps with painted walls, wide windows, and smooth floors made from planks instead of earth. Yet even if that day arrives, the memory of this sod house will remain part of the land. It was the first shelter built from the prairie itself. The place where winter storms were endured. The place where stories were told beside the stove. You turn back towards the room again. The fire continues burning quietly, its warm light flickering across the earthen walls. For now, this house made from grass and soil remains exactly what it was always meant to be. A simple refuge in the vast winter prairie. By the time the prairie begins loosening its grip on winter, the sod house reveals a different side of itself. The first sign arrives quietly. You notice it when stepping outside one morning and feeling the snow beneath your boots soften instead of crunch. The air still carries a sharp chill, but something in the sunlight feels different. The brightness lingers longer across the land, and the sky holds a faint promise of change. Spring is approaching, not suddenly and certainly not gently, but gradually. You stand beside the house and look across the prairie. Snow still covers much of the ground, yet patches of darker earth begin appearing where wind and sunlight have worked together to thin the drifts. The prairie looks restless again. Inside the sod house, the stove still burns each morning, but it no longer struggles as fiercely against the cold. The air warms more easily during the day, and the walls release the heat they stored through winter nights. But as the weather shifts, the house begins presenting new challenges. You notice the first one while stepping near the doorway. The ground beneath your boot gives slightly. Where the floor once felt firm and dusty, it now feels softer, almost spongy in places. Snow outside is melting slowly, and that moisture has begun working its way into the soil beneath the house. Mud. It is one of the most familiar companions of prairie spring. Agricultural reports written during the 19th century often describe the seasonal transformation known as the spring thaw. After months of frozen ground, warming temperatures allowed snow and ice to melt quickly. Without modern drainage systems, water soaked into the soil everywhere. The prairie became damp and heavy for several weeks. You step back inside and glance down at the dirt floor. Dark patches now appear where dampness has reached the surface. The ground near the door feels especially soft-shaped by repeated footsteps moving in and out of the house. The floor may not look elegant, but it tells a clear story of the changing season. You fetch the broom and sweep gently across the surface, though today the dust refuses to raise. Instead, the soil clings together in small clumps that move slowly across the floor. Winter dust has become spring mud. One curious recollection recorded in a Dakota Territory diary describes how some settlers laid old boards or flat stones across their floors during the spring thaw. These makeshift pathways allowed people to move around the house without sinking into the damp ground beneath their feet. It was a simple solution that many families appreciated. You place a small wooden plank near the doorway where the mud has grown thickest. Instantly, the floor becomes easier to cross. Outside, the prairie continues its slow transformation. Water trickles through shallow depressions in the stow where sunlight has carved narrow channels. Small streams form briefly before soaking into the thirsty soil below. The land feels alive again. Yet spring on the plains rarely arrives with gentle warmth. Instead, it moves in waves. One day, the air may feel mild enough to melt large patches of snow. The next day, a cold wind might return from the north, freezing everything once more beneath a thin sheet of ice. Researchers who study prairie weather often point out that this unpredictable pattern defined early spring across the Great Plains. Settlers learned quickly that winter could return several times before the season truly changed. You lean against the doorframe and watch the prairie carefully. The snow continues shrinking slowly across the land. Grass stalks begin appearing, where drifts have melted away their pale stems, flattened by months of wind and ice. Soon new growth will follow. Inside the sod house, the damp floor reminds you that the structure itself responds to these seasonal changes. Because the house rests directly on the prairie soil, it experiences the same cycles of freezing and thawing as the land outside. The walls remain steady. The roof holds firm, but the ground beneath your feet shifts gently with the season. Modern historians studying sod houses often describe them as structures that lived alongside the prairie, rather than standing apart from it. Their materials responded naturally to weather and temperature, making them part of the environment instead of separate from it. That relationship becomes especially clear during spring. You step carefully across the plank near the doorway and return to the table beside the stove. The fire burns more softly now, no longer required to battle extreme cold. The room feels comfortable. Outside, the prairie slowly awakens beneath the warming sun. Inside the sod house, the damp floor and soft earth remind you that winter is finally beginning to release its hold on the plains. As the prairie continues its slow transition from winter towards spring, you begin to appreciate something that many settlers eventually realized about these unusual homes. Despite their rough appearance, sod houses actually worked remarkably well. You sit near the window one afternoon and look carefully at the thick wall beside you. The blocks of earth remain tightly stacked, their tangled roots binding the soil into a structure that has endured months of wind, snow, and freezing temperatures. The house may not resemble the polished buildings found in towns, yet it has quietly performed its task. It has protected you. When strong prairie winds roared across the plains, the heavy sod walls barely moved. Their weight and density absorbed the force of the storms in a way that surprised many early settlers. Visitors travelling through the Great Plains during the late 19th century often commented on how sturdy these earthen homes appeared. Some travellers initially laughed at the idea of living inside a house made from grass and soil, only to change their opinion after witnessing how well the structures endured harsh prairie weather. You run your hand along the wall and feel its cool, solid surface. The roots woven through the sod bricks act almost like natural rope holding the soil together in a surprisingly durable form. Prairie grasses develop these deep root systems over centuries, anchoring the soil against wind and drought. That same strength now forms the skeleton of your home. Outside, the wind rises briefly and moves across the prairie, brushing the snow in soft drifting lines. Inside the house, the sound reaches you only faintly. The walls muffle it easily. This natural insulation became one of the most valuable features of sod houses. Thick earthen walls slowed the movement of heat and cold, helping maintain a stable temperature inside the room. In winter, the stove warmed the soil, which then released that warmth slowly throughout the night. In summer, the same walls helped keep the interior cooler than the blazing prairie outside. You lean back slightly and glance toward the stove near the center of the room. The fire burns steadily, though it no longer needs to work as hard as it did during the coldest winter nights. The house now holds warmth with quiet efficiency. Agricultural bulletins and homestead guides from the frontier era occasionally noted this advantage. Builders discovered that sod walls sometimes performed better than thin wooden walls when it came to controlling temperature. Nature had already designed the prairie soil to resist harsh weather. Settlers simply borrowed that design. One delightful anecdote from a Kansas pioneer memoir tells of a traveler who once mistook a sod house for a small hill while crossing the plains. Only when he noticed smoke rising from the chimney did he realize that the mound of earth actually contained a family living comfortably inside. From a distance, the structure blended perfectly with the surrounding landscape. You smile at the thought. The prairie itself became the house. You stand and walk slowly across the room, noticing how the sunlight touches the walls. Small variations in the soil create gentle shades of brown and grey across the surface. Tiny roots twist through the bricks like threads in a woven blanket. Nothing about the house feels artificial. Everything belongs to the land. Modern historians who study frontier architecture often highlight this remarkable practically. Sod houses required very few purchases of materials, could be built quickly, and used resources available directly beneath settlers' feet. For families arriving with limited supplies, that simplicity made survival possible. Some scholars even suggest that sod houses represented one of the most efficient housing solutions ever developed for the environment of the Great Plains. You pause near the door and glance outside again. The prairie stretches wide beneath the open sky, still holding patches of snow but slowly revealing more of the brown earth beneath. The house stands quietly within that landscape, low, solid, almost invisible from a distance. And that invisibility brought advantages as well, because the roof and walls were made from earth sod houses, blended naturally into the terrain. Strong prairie winds passed over them instead of striking tall exposed surfaces. The house behaved almost like part of the ground itself. You return to the table and sit once more. The room feels calm and steady, shaped by months of winter living. What once seemed unusual now feels completely familiar. The dirt floor beneath your boots, the earthen walls surrounding the space, the low ceiling beams supporting a roof of grass and soil. These features no longer feel strange. They feel practical. Outside, the prairie wind drifts softly across the open land while the afternoon light begins fading toward evening. Inside the sod house, the warmth of the stove and the strength of the thick walls continue working together, quietly proving once again that sometimes the simplest solutions turn out to be the most effective. As winter slowly loosens its hold on the prairie, life around the sod house begins changing in quiet but noticeable ways. You step outside one early morning and pause beside the doorway. The air still carries a chill, but it no longer cuts sharply against your face. Instead, it feels softer, almost hesitant, as if the season itself is deciding whether to stay or leave. The snow has nearly vanished. Only small patches remain where deep drifts once stood, lingering in the shadow of fences and low hills. Across most of the prairie, the earth has begun showing itself again, dark and damp from melting ice. The land looks raw and restless. Small streams of water creep through shallow channels in the soil, winding their way slowly across the open ground. The prairie drinks eagerly after months of frozen stillness. You take a few careful steps across the muddy surface. Your boots sink slightly into the softened earth. The firm crunch of winter snow has been replaced by the quiet squish of thawing soil. Spring is arriving, yet life on the prairie never moves forward without effort. Inside the sod house, the changing season brings new tasks to your attention. You step back through the doorway and look around the familiar room. The walls remain strong, the roof holds steady, but the winter months have left small signs of wear that now require attention. Near the corner of the room, you notice a faint trickle of moisture running down one sod brick where melting snow from the roof has begun seeping through the outer layers. It is not a serious problem. Still, it deserves repair. Practical manuals written for prairie settlers often advised inspecting sod houses carefully during the spring thaw. As ice melted within the roof and walls, moisture sometimes worked its way into small openings that had remained invisible during colder months. Early repairs prevented larger problems later. You step outside again and climb carefully onto the low slope of the roof. The surface feels soft beneath your boots. Grass roots woven through the soil create a sturdy layer that holds the sod together, though patches of exposed dirt reveal where winter winds have thinned the covering. From up here, the prairie stretches endlessly in every direction. The wide land rolls gently beneath the open sky, broken only by distant farmsteads and narrow lines of fence marking homestead boundaries. Settlement records from the late 19th century often describe how isolated many prairie homes felt during these early years. Neighbours sometimes lived miles apart with nothing but open grassland between them. Standing on the roof makes that isolation especially clear. You kneel near the area where moisture appeared inside the house and press fresh soil into the thin spot. The damp earth moulds easily beneath your hands, sealing the surface once again. It is a simple repair. Yet repairs like this kept sod houses strong through changing seasons. You smooth the soil, carefully pressing down the loose grass roots until the patch blends with the surrounding roof. While you work, the prairie breeze carries the faint scent of wet earth and thawing grass. The smell feels different from winter air. It carries warmth and movement. One unusual recollection preserved in a homesteader's diary mentions how some prairie families planted small patches of wildflowers directly into their sod roofs once spring arrived. Over time, the flowers blended with the grass already growing there, turning the roofs into living gardens. Imagine looking up from the prairie and seeing a roof blooming with colour. You finish smoothing the repaired section and sit back briefly on the roof. From here, the sod house looks even smaller than it does from the ground. The thick walls rise only slightly above the surrounding earth, blending naturally into the landscape. The prairie almost seems to reclaim the house. Some modern historians who study frontier housing have suggested that sod houses represented one of the earliest examples of environmentally integrated architecture on the plains. Rather than imposing an artificial structure on the land, settlers built homes that worked with the materials and climate of the prairie itself. It was not elegant by modern standards, but it was remarkably practical. You climb down from the roof and brush the damp soil from your hands. The repaired section now looks strong again, ready to face the shifting weather of spring. Inside the house, the stove burns more gently than it did during winter. Its warmth fills the room without the fierce intensity once required to battle freezing nights. The air feels lighter now. Through the window, you watch sunlight spread across the prairie. Small birds move across the open land, returning to places that had been silent beneath snow only weeks before. Life is slowly returning. Inside the sod house, the quiet work of maintenance continues just as it always has. The house stands steady on the thawing prairie, its walls of earth and grass proving once again that sometimes the simplest shelters are the ones most closely connected to the land around them. By the time spring fully settles across the prairie, the sod house begins to feel slightly different. Not larger, not newer, but somehow lighter. You notice the change first in the mornings. When you wake and step down onto the dirt floor, the room no longer carries the deep stillness of winter. Instead, faint sounds from outside drift gently through the walls and window. Birdsong. It arrives quietly at first, just a few tentative notes floating across the prairie air. Then more voices join in until the open land feels alive with small movements and chirping calls. You open the door and step outside. The prairie looks completely transformed from the frozen landscape that surrounded the house only weeks ago. Snow has vanished almost entirely now, In its place stretches a wide field of damp earth and emerging grass. The land breathes again. Small green shoots push upward through the soil, their colour bright against the darker ground. Water glistens in the shallow pools left behind by the melting snow. The air carries a soft scent of fresh growth. You walk a few steps away from the house and turn to look back at it. During winter, the sod house blended almost perfectly with the snowdrifts and pale sky. Now its earthy walls stand out more clearly against the brightening prairie. Grass begins sprouting across the roof with tiny blades pushing upward through the soil where winter winds once swept bare patches. The house itself seems to be growing. Homestead records from the late 19th century frequently describe how sod roofs came alive each spring. Because the bricks used to build the house were cut directly from prairie grassland, the living roots within them often continued growing once warmer weather returned. A sod house could literally become greener as the season changed. You smile at the thought of living beneath a roof that behaves like part of the prairie. The stove inside the house now burns only occasionally. During most days, the sunlight and mild air provide enough warmth to keep the room comfortable. You step back through the doorway and notice how the interior feels brighter as well. The window stands open slightly, allowing fresh air to move slowly through the room. The earthy scent of the walls mixes with the smell of damp soil and new grass from outside. It feels refreshing after months of heavy winter air. The house has endured the hardest part of the year. Travel accounts written by settlers moving westward across the plains often mention how dramatic this seasonal change felt after a long prairie winter. Many described spring as a kind of release when both the land and the people living on it seemed to wake from a long sleep. Winter demanded patience. Spring rewarded that patience with movement and life. You sit near the table and listen to the quiet sounds drifting through the open window. Wind brushing softly across the ground. Distant birds calling across the prairie. The occasional creak of the sod walls warming gently beneath the sunlight. One curious recollection from a Kansas homestead memoir tells of children climbing onto the roof during spring to watch new grass sprout from the sod blocks. According to the writer, they proudly declared that their house was turning into a meadow. From a certain perspective, they were not entirely wrong. You stand again and walk slowly around the room. The familiar objects remain in their places. The wooden chest near the wall. The table where meals were shared during cold evenings. The stove that carried the family through months of snow and wind. Yet the atmosphere of the room feels different now. The long winter that once pressed heavily against the sod walls has loosened its grip. Some modern historians who examine prairie settlement have suggested that surviving the first winter often marked a turning point for homesteading families. Those who endured the season gained confidence that they could adapt to the demanding environment of the Great Plains. The sod house played an important role in that survival. Its thick earthen walls protected families when winds roared across the prairie. Its roof held fast, firm beneath it. Drifting snow. Its simple construction provided shelter using nothing more than the land itself. You step back outside one more time and look across the open prairie. Green shoots now appear everywhere you look. The land stretches wide and hopeful beneath the bright sky. Behind you, the sod house stands quietly on the prairie soil, its walls made from the same earth that now produces new life across the plains. It began as a temporary shelter, but through the long winter it proved something more. A home shaped directly from the prairie. As the prairie settles fully into spring, the sod house rests quietly beneath the wide sky, carrying the memory of the long winter it has just endured. You step outside at the early evening and pause beside the doorway. The air feels gentle now, far removed from the biting cold that once ruled this land. A soft breeze moves through the young grass, bending the bright green blades in slow waves that ripple across the prairie. Birds glide across the open sky above you. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark calls its clear song, floating easily through the warm air. The prairie no longer feels silent or empty. Instead, it hums with life. You turn and look back at the house that sheltered you through the winter months. The sod walls rise quietly from the earth, their rough texture softened by the returning sunlight. Patches of fresh grass grow along the roof, blending the structure once again into the landscape. From a distance, it almost disappears. A traveller crossing the plains might see nothing more than a low hill covered with prairie grass. Yet inside those earthen walls an entire season of living has unfolded. You step back through the doorway and glance around the familiar room. The dirt floor beneath your boots still carries faint marks from winter work. The stove sits quietly now, its iron surface cool after months of steady use. The table stands where meals were shared while blizzards roared outside. Every corner of the room holds a memory. Winter nights when the wind howled across the plains. Morning chores performed in the freezing air. Quiet evenings beside the stove while stories filled the small house with warmth. Frontier diaries written by prairie settlers often describe this feeling at the end of the first winter. Surviving the season brought more than simple relief. It created a sense of belonging to the land itself. The prairie had tested you, and the sod house helped you endure that test. You sit down near the window and watch the fading light spread gently across the fields. The setting sun paints the prairie in warm colours that glow softly against the young grass. The sod walls around you absorb the warmth of the evening, just as they once absorbed the heat of the winter stove. These walls were built from the same soil now growing fresh plants outside. A curious story recorded in an early homestead memoir describes how one settler once joked that his house was the only home in the world that might slowly turn back into a prairie if left alone long enough. Grass already grew on the roof. The walls were made from earth. In time the land could reclaim it entirely. You smile quietly at the thought. Perhaps that is part of what makes the sod house so remarkable. It was never meant to conquer the prairie. It simply borrowed a piece of it. Researchers who study prairie settlement often emphasize how closely early homesteaders depended on the environment around them. Instead of bringing large supplies of building materials from distant places, they used the resources available beneath their feet. The prairie provided soil, grass, and strength. Human effort shaped those materials into shelter. You lean back and let the quiet rooms settle around you. Outside, the sky darkens slowly as evening deepens across the plains. The last light fades behind the distant horizon, leaving a soft twilight stretching across the land. The prairie wind moves gently through the grass. Inside the sod house, the air feels calm and peaceful. The long winter that once filled this room with crackling firelight and drifting snow has passed into memory. In its place comes a quieter season filled with warmth, sunlight, and growing life. You breathe slowly and listen to the soft sounds of the prairie night beginning outside. And now, as the day fades and the gentle prairie wind moves across the grass, the little sod house rests quietly once more beneath the endless sky. The walls of earth hold the warmth of the day. The land stretches wide and peaceful around you, and the quiet rhythm of life on the prairie continues calm and steady just as it has through every season. So now the fire is low, the prairie is calm, and the long winter story has reached its quiet end. The room grows softer. The wind grows gentler. Your thoughts slow like the fading light across the plains. And as the sod house settles into the peaceful prairie night, you can let your eyes grow heavy and drift slowly towards sleep. Sweet dreams,